What is the creepiest glitch in the Matrix you've experienced? Not sure if anyone will believe me or not, but fuck it, here goes. When I was in high school, my friend Phil killed himself. I never really knew the specifics. All I know is that he shot himself at one of the local parks. Fast forward 6 years or so, and I'm asleep in bed next to my ex-wife. I'm having a fairly normal dream. I was at a store doing something or another. I can't really remember the specifics of the beginning of the dream. What I do remember is running into Phil in the store. When I saw him, everything got super weird. He actually looked like Phil, not like in most dreams, where people will be certain people, but not look like them. He actually looked like Phil. He looked at me and smiled and said, "Hey man." At the moment the dream got crystal clear. I asked him if it was really him, and he said it was. He told me we were gonna hang out for a bit, and after that the dream got super lucid. He showed me how to make stuff, and generally we just faked around doing dream things. Suddenly I realized that my dream was coming to an end. I turned to him and asked him if I was about to wake up. He said yes, and said he had fun coming to hang out with me for a bit. I don't know why, but I asked, "So why'd you do it, man? Why'd you kill yourself?" The way he answered chilled me to my core. Not necessarily what he said, just how he said it. He replied, "My girlfriend cheated on me, man." He said it like it was a question he'd answered before. Like when someone asks you what your first job was, you've responded with the exact same sentence so many times that it just falls off of your tongue effortless. Except I had known his girlfriend and they were the kind of couple that everyone admired. I said, Sophie cheated on you?" His eyes lit up, like he realized he was talking to someone that actually knew him in life. He said, "Yeah man, Sophie cheated on me." We gave each other a hug and he wished me well. I woke up and felt super strange. It was somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. I closed my eyes and thought, "Phil, if that was really you, I need you to give me a sign." No sooner than when that thought finished, my phone started ringing. It came across as an unknown number and only rang twice. I knew I wasn't dreaming anymore because my ex-wife woke up and sleepily asked me who was trying to call me so late. To this day, when I think about that story, I get chills. I have a weird one. Back in October of 2005 I met my now wife. We had first hooked up on a Saturday night at a gig in the city and we arranged to meet again the following Wednesday night for a beer or a coffee. I remember feeling like absolute crap on the Wednesday morning after being out the night before at a bar for my birthday with my buddies, drinking and getting high and whatnot. I really did want to call her and see her again, but I felt so shitty that I just knew I wouldn't make a good impression. I had no energy, looked and felt like something the cat dragged in, and I just wanted to sleep. I was really dreading calling her to postpone in case she took it the wrong way and thought I was ditching her. When my cell phone rang that afternoon, I answered it automatically without really registering the number, as it was on an old cheaty Nokia with a green 2-inch screen. It was a girl's voice on the line asking me did I mind if she took a rain check on our date that evening. She said she was hoping we could meet up again the following weekend instead, as she was really tired from work. Totally relieved, I said no problem at all. When we met up again on the following Friday, we got to talking, and I confessed that I was glad she had postponed our date as I felt terrible the previous Wednesday. She replied that she hadn't called me on Wednesday afternoon and that she hadn't rain checked our initial date. She had however been expecting my call, and she told me that she had just assumed I didn't call her because I was being an asshole. She said when I actually did call her on the Thursday to arrange the date, she changed her opinion and thought I was okay. My phone record showed I had accepted a call on Wednesday afternoon that lasted 3 minutes, but the number came up blocked. I guess in hindsight I could have investigated further by asking the cell phone company to obtain the details of the blocked number, but I didn't really think too much about it back at the time. As time goes by, I sometimes wonder if whoever I spoke to on my cell phone on that Wednesday afternoon intervened in our lives in some way for some reason. We are married with children now, and from time to time, when I contemplate the events, a Marty McFly BTTF sheet comes into my mind. Who the fuck knows? I just know it was something odd as a cod. This may not be woo-woo creepy the way most stories are, but here goes. I find that if I stop trying to control everything and let things happen as they will, The universe will send the exact personal thing I need to me. I lost my job a few years ago and went home totally dejected. I decided to rest for that night and not stress about a job hunt until the next morning. The next morning I was awakened by a phone call from this guy who was a friend of my ex-boss, who just opened his own restaurant and wanted to know if I wanted to work there. It was like the universe had gift wrapped me a new job and deposited it into my lap. Another time I had found a new apartment, which was only a few blocks from my old apartment. I was heading to my old place to pack my stuff, not really sure how I was going to get it all packed and moved by my lonesome, but I had that same feeling. That feeling of it will work itself out. I think my phone had gone dead, so I stopped a random guy on the street to ask what time it was. He asked me casually what I was doing, and I told him, "Oh, I'm about to pack and try to move all my things." And this rando said, "I'll help you." For some reason, I wasn't wary of him. I felt like it was meant to be. So he came with me to my old place, helped me pack, and then helped me carry my stuff to my new place. He was super nice and helpful, and it was like it was all meant to be, like he'd been put there, right on that particular street corner at that particular moment, to fix my predicament. I had a weird one in college. There was a girl I was seeing with whom I had a fairly brief, but really intense romantic relationship with. Things ended in the spring, and I didn't want that, so I was pretty mopey and depressed about the entire thing for a while afterwards. The girl moved out of state to take a job, which helped a little bit, but we still stayed in contact. Well, one particular weekend she was coming back to town. I knew that and decided I didn't really want to see her. We had dozens of mutual friends, so I decided I was just going to lay low for the weekend and avoid everyone. I got up late and hung over on Saturday and flipped on the football game. At some point in the mid-afternoon, a fuse blew in the little TV I was using. I decided that I would head out to Radio Shack at the mall to see if I could find a replacement fuse. As soon as I start driving, I think, ugh, I haven't showered, I feel gross, I do not want to see her. And I start feeling this dread about going to Radio Shack. It didn't make any sense, as there was no reason that I would have had any reason to think she would be at the mall. So finally it bothers me enough that I think, hey, maybe Mejias would have fuses, even though I knew they wouldn't. So I head there and of course come away empty-handed. So I'm starting to get that feeling of dread again about seeing this girl, because now I think I have to go to Radio Shack at the mall. I feel gross, and I don't want to dredge up old feelings again. It is to a point where I'm aware of the dread and aware that it doesn't make any sense to be worried about running into her there. So I decided instead to go to Best Buy, which I knew wouldn't have the fuse, just on the chance that they would, and I could avoid Radio Shack at the mall. Well, of course they didn't have the fuse. So now I have resigned myself to going to Radio Shack at the mall to get this fuse, and I feel awful. Like I headed to the gallows, dread and butterflies in my stomach as I drive over to the mall. But when I get to the mall, I think, of course, Sears will have fuses, and have this exhilarating feeling of relief. Sears is an anchor store at the mall, so I can enter through the Sears entrance and avoid the mall altogether. So, Sears has fuses, but not the one I think I need. So I just start slowly walking through Sears out to the mall. I feel terrible. I just feel this sense of dread. I realize it makes no sense, so I'm confused and anxious. Radio Shack was 2 stores away from the mall entrance to Sears. My plan was to emerge from Sears and quickly sneak into the Radio Shack before anyone had a chance to see me. The second I set foot on tile floor in the mall, I hear my name called from the other side of the indoor courtyard. I look up, and there she is. I figure nobody will read this, but it has been nagging me for decades. When I was 7, I went skiing with my younger brother. It had snowed, there was a suitable hill nearby, I remember the wooden skis, etc. After some time I had to pee. There were a lot of kids about, and adults too, out strolling for their Sunday afternoon walk. Germans did/do that. So no ducking in the bushes, and all the winter gear I had on was in the way. So I had to go home. A shortcut, think hypotenuse of a right triangle, across the field was the quickest way, except for the deep ditch where it intersected with the road. I tried stepping up the ditch and kept sliding back down. My skis didn't have good edges. I started crying, being frustrated and having to pee. I didn't even think of taking the skis off. Suddenly I get lifted out of the ditch, set on the snowy road, and I can still see the worsted wool overcoat and sleeve of the man that did that. I can even smell the damp wool as I was held against him during the lift. I wiped my nose/eyes, collect my poles, and turn to thank my savior, and he is gone. There are people, but nobody wears a coat like that. No tall men. Not one way, not the other. I have a clear view for minimum 100 meters, 330 feet, either way, and the guy was not running, and I was polite, so I didn't wait long to say thank you. I have been back there many times, and even measured out the distance on Google Maps. There is simply no way I could have not seen the person who lifted me out of the ditch. I have literally spent time timing people walk there. It takes most minutes to walk that corner, yet my rescuer was gone. This isn't so much creepy, but somewhat I feel. My step-grandfather was my best friend. My main father figure in my life, as I never met my dad. Before he passed, he had a stroke and he wasn't able to speak, nor was he able to communicate in any way. He was only able to move his eyes, but not so much. At one point I spent the night at the hospital as it was my shift to take over while my grandma and my mom went home to undress. While he was asleep I just had this urge that I need to tell him everything now, almost like I only have this amount of time left, so tell him everything. I told him how much I loved him, and how much he meant to me, and that he's going to get better, and we are going to go fishing, and do the fun stuff we usually do. The next morning my mom and grandma get to the hospital and my grandfather is still asleep, so I head home to rest for a bit. I get home, take a shower and log into WoW. My girlfriend on the couch behind him. I smell my grandfather's scent. As strong as ever, his cologne. Almost felt like he was sitting right next to me. Then I feel this really warm hand touch my, and as I'm about to reach my shoulder to touch it, my girlfriend answers my cell phone and touches the same shoulder, and tells me my grandfather passes away. I was devastated to say the least. Fast forward to about 8 months later. I was in dark place and just needed someone to talk to. My grandfather was the main person I talked to about everything. I was having a rage, almost like I needed closure to why my grandfather passed away, and I needed him. I also needed to know why he passed, and why something so awful would happen. He wasn't able to respond, which hurt the most. I have this dream. The room was all white, almost blinding white. There's a table in the middle of the room and I see this elderly man sitting, and I go over and sit down, and it's my grandfather. He asks how I'm doing, and I spill my guts out and tell him everything, fully crying, tears and snot everywhere. All he says, I'm doing fine, and I heard everything you said. Just know I will always be with you, and if you ever need me, I will be there. Then I wake suddenly. My pillow is soaked, and feel my face is wet from all the tears I just wept. Most surreal experience I have ever had. I was the fat nerdy kid in middle school. I also happened to grow up in a pretty rough part of town. My parents divorced and thought it would be best for me to change schools anyway. I didn't tell anyone I was moving away. At the time, the so-called friends I had wouldn't miss me anyway. Oh, how wrong I was. A year later my mom received an email one night from an old friend of mine. He went on to tell her how sorry he was for her loss and how we used to be good friends. Also that, if she needed anyone to help with anything, he and his family would be right there at any cost. My mom of course freaked and quickly responded asking what he was talking about. As it turned out, a kid who shared my first and last name and same middle initial committed suicide just a month prior. My mom responded back explaining that I was literally right next to her and that I was fine and well. He then sent the most chilling thing I've ever experienced. It was his obituary page his family created in his memory. This kid was me to a T. If I had never played football, started smoking weed, got laid or any of the things that broke me from my shell, we cold bean twins. Our views, aspirations, life goals, hobbies and demeanor all seemed to be the same. We even wore the same style glasses. I still get chills to this day when I think about it, and from time to time I visit his page to read about him. I wish we cold've met. I bet we'd be great friends. No one knew why he did what he did. but from what I can tell he was bound for great things. Please y'all, suicide is never the answer. I've been on the verge of it, and every day I'm still here. I thank myself for not pulling the trigger. Your life is worth more than you can possibly imagine. If not to someone else, then definitely to yourself. So, some context. I lived in a dead steel town. Buildings were put up somewhat haphazardly. If you imagine your typical suburban block, imagine instead of a backyard you had another house or two. It was kinda cramped. My mom, grandma, brothers and I lived in the 2-story duplex at the front of the property. It's more or less a traditional house, unlike the building on the back of the property. That one was 3 stories tall and is basically a large above ground basement and shed with 2 stories of apartments on top. The buildings were maybe 15 feet apart from one another anyways. My uncle rented the middle apartment for a few years, sold drugs from it, got addicted to drugs in it, fell out of a stable relationship into one with a junkie. Went from being reasonably well off to losing the grip on his life. He ended up moving in with us after the city had to cut off water to the back for some infrastructure issue, and my grandma had them cut the power as well. My mom, brothers, and I moved out shortly after she married, but he returned a couple years later, after it fell apart. About 2 months into living there again, I'm up late, and I smell a bit of smoke, which is nothing normal. My uncle was always up late, usually high, doing something in the kitchen. Turns out this time he passed out with grease on the stove. We didn't know that at the time, but as I got up to check on the smell, my grandma screamed for everyone to get out of the house. We didn't know where he was, but the fire stopped us from getting to his room. A couple cops showed up after I tried hooking up a hose from the shed to a spigot, which was unfortunately tied to the back house's now defunct water line. I suggested breaking the window to his room, but the cops said the air might fuel the fire, and it was best to leave it alone. We tried banging on it and shouting for my uncle, but didn't know he had out at that point. Out of ideas, I woke up my friend from across the street and we watched from his porch as the fire trucks arrived. My uncle died. He was alive when they found him, but he died later at the hospital due to smoke inhalation. Even had he survived, this particular rod was pretty bad, and he would most likely have suffered some permanent issues from it. Anyways, the house was well enough off to be gutted and refitted. It was about a year later that my mother, I forget what she was doing, noticed that there was a light on in my uncle's old apartment. Given his history, we assumed it was some kids or his old junkie friends squatting or lighting up. We call the cops and the same initial responders from the fire show up. They cautiously go up the stairs, peek in the windows, knock, and shout without a sign from anyone. Sure enough, no one's there. They tell my grandma and mom, who are still confused to the source of the light. The power's been cut for a couple years, after all. We go up there with the cops and find that the ceiling light in the living room is on, which doesn't make sense. We flick the switch and nothing happens. My grandma and mom start to freak out, which unsettles the cops, especially the one that had a few run-ins with my uncle. We leave and watch the apartment for a couple more hours until the light cut out. Didn't fade, just turned off. TLDR, my uncle died on the property. The apartment he used to rent, which had all of the utilities cut, was lit up one night. We call the cops expecting a break-in and find no one. But they do find the ceiling light on despite an apparent lack of electricity that's also unresponsive to the switch. When I was about 12 years old, I had an experience with someone who can only be reasonably explained as a lost time traveler or spooked burglar. I was sitting on my computer, which was right by the sliding glass doors leading to my backyard. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw a strangely familiar man standing by the short gate, looking at me. I lived in a townhome community, so there was a path connecting all the backyards. It wasn't uncommon to see other people back there. For some reason, being observed didn't bother me as much as it should have. So I shrugged it off and went back to playing my computer game. In my peripheral vision, I noticed movement and saw that the man was about halfway into my backyard now. Every time I looked at him, he seemed to freeze. I got a better look at him this time, and while he looked extremely familiar, there was something deeply disturbing about the look in his eyes. I could only describe it as dark. Clearly the only logical thing to do at this point was to go back to playing my game, so that's what I did. The next time I casually looked out into my backyard, he was right by the glass door staring directly down at me. He didn't look particularly menacing then, more so like a man deeply perplexed by what he was seeing. Well, at that point I felt that it was too late for me to try to get away from the window because he was literally directly across the glass, less than a foot away from me. So in my most ballsy power move to date, I looked him right in the eyes, smiled a bit, and went back to playing my game. This deeply unsettled him, and he started to quickly back away while still looking in my general direction. When he left, I just went back to playing my game and didn't even mention it to anyone until years later. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I acted any differently. Left work at 20:39. My home was about 30 miles away. I hopped on my motorcycle and got on the road. Just as I got into the access ramp, I blinked heavily to avoid being blinded by a passing truck. Then I opened my eyes, found myself on a completely different place that I could not recognize. Motorcycle still going at a decent speed. The highway that takes me home was accompanied by the usual urban landscape. I was sitting in the middle of a small road with woods around me. I felt stiff and cramped as if I had been riding for miles non-stop, and my helmet was gone from my face. The helmet wasn't the only thing missing. Once I stopped, I realized my jacket, wallet, my backpack and my shirt were all gone. Was riding in my tank top. The clothes I had left were stained with mud and torn in a few places, and I had a dozen small cuts and bumps on my forearms and hands. Also, my knuckles and wrists hurt as sin. I pulled up Google on my phone and found that I had gone almost 136 miles in the opposite direction I was supposed to take. I had left at 20:39. It was now 4 o'clock. I had no idea how I got there, where my stuff went, how I had refueled the motorcycle on the way, and why I didn't remember a single part of it. My bike was running on fumes and died a few miles later, still in the middle of nowhere. I ended up having to call the cops to be rescued given the circumstances, who were just as puzzled as I was. But in the end, all I got was a tow for my bike and a ride to the hospital. The cuts on my arms? Doctor said it looked like the scratches someone gets from either rock climbing or being around thorns. 2 knuckles on my right hand were fractured, and I had dislocated my index finger on the left hand. It had partially snapped into place. The bike had no damage to it whatsoever, so I ruled out auto accident or falling off. Only supposed explanation is that at some point I got off the bike and decided to play Rambo in the woods, then went boxing with a tree. It was weird as hell. Doctor figured I entered some kind of induced hypnosis or vogue state due to stress, and instinct made me follow the road. I don't feel this explains it at all, because it still doesn't explain how I managed to refuel the bike, where my stuff went, and where had my 8 hours gone. I never figured out anything about this incident, since nothing really bad happened to me, despite the fact someone tried to use my missing credit card to pay $50k worth of crap. Edit. Just realized something. My motorcycle is a Harley 883 Roadster 2011, which I converted to 1200cc and took out the speed limiter. It gets to 200 km/h, 124 miles per hour, easily, and that's hardly its top speed. When I came to, I was riding at 160 km/h, 100 miles per hour, which means I was hauling as either way. It does not take 8 hours for a bike such as mine to make a 136-mile travel. It does take 2 tanks depending on how hard I ride it, but still, this only adds to the confusion now. A couple years ago, my grandpa got really sick. He was in the hospital for a couple days and had a major surgery. 2 weeks after the surgery, he was recovering perfectly and everything was great. I went with my mom to visit a family friend, and on the drive home I started crying because my grandpa was going to die and I couldn't handle it. My mom was so confused because I hadn't been worried about it before when he was actually likely to die. I was only crying now that he was recovered and perfectly fine. I got home and went to bed. At 3:08 the next morning, I woke up randomly. I remember the exact time because my friend had texted me while I was asleep and I replied when I woke up. I was up for about 10 minutes and then went back to sleep. I woke up again around 8 and right afterwards my great grandma called to tell us that my grandpa had been taken to the hospital in the middle of the night and died at 3:08. A similar thing happened to my best friend. Her dad had brain cancer for 7 years. Doctors would always say he only had months left, but she stopped believing them because it had been 7 years. I met her 3 years before her dad died. Not long after we met, her mom picked her up from school early to go say bye to her dad because the doctors were sure he wouldn't make it through the night. She told me this happened about once a year and she always panicked over it, and then he was fine. Then she said one day it'll happen on April Fool's Day and I won't believe her, and that will be the day he actually dies 3 years later. Her mom came to pick her up early from school on April Fool's Day. She rolled her eyes at me and said this is such a dark prank. I can't believe she'd do this, and reluctantly went with her mom. Her dad had actually died. Went into a CVS in the afternoon for something, and I was rushing because it was looking like a storm was about to start. Got what I came for, and just as I was walking out the front door, lightning cracked across the sky. The really weird part was that during the lightning strike all other lights seemed to go dark. The whole sky was dark. The parking lot was dark. It was as if for that brief moment it became night, and then went right back to day. Everyone in the lot stopped and looked around for a second, and then we all just looked at each other like, whoa. Edit, another one. As a kid I was in Boy Scouts. We went on a camping trip in winter. They provided tents for us, and we were only allowed to be 2 people in staying in one tent. I convinced the scout master to let me stay in a tent with 2 boys who were in high school. I thought they were super cool and wanted their approval. Just after everyone went to bed, we took our sleeping bags and crowded into another tent with 2 other guys, also older than me, to hang out. At some point, after we finally went to sleep, I woke up and the tent was empty except for me and my sleeping bag. I thought maybe they went out to do something, but why take their sleeping bags? Also, for some reason I thought I was back in our original tent. Went back to sleep and woke up again and everything and everyone were back in their places around me. Point another one. For Christmas one year, I got a perpetual motion machine that was simply an astronaut in a silver ring that would swing back and forth and do flips. It took batteries, but they were only to power an electromagnet in the base that pushed on a magnet on the ring to keep it going. I would turn it on every night when I went to bed, and in the morning it would be stuck with the astronaut upside down. I couldn't imagine how it was getting stuck, so one night I decided to stay awake and watch it until it stopped. It had a pattern that it always followed. It would build up its swings until it finally flipped, and sometimes it looked like it was about to get stuck, but then it wouldn't. It kept going and going, and I was getting tired, but then it finally stuck halfway through a flip. The moment it stuck, the whole room seemed to become several shades brighter and the act of it suddenly freezing was very creepy. Not me, but my uncle. A little backstory. My grandpa died a couple years back. It was pretty unexpected, and my whole family was, of course, devastated. Another thing to keep in mind is that my grandma has always been very into bird watching, and her favorite bird is a cardinal. My grandpa knew this. My uncle is the kind of guy who loves nature and would stop and help animals on the side of the road whenever he saw anything out of the ordinary. So, one day, my uncle, grandma, and grandpa's son was driving home from work in his very old, very loud truck and came across a cardinal sitting in the road. He was on a back road, and as he approached in his very loud truck, he was surprised to find that the bird didn't fly away like one would expect it to. My uncle, being the kind of guy he is, pulled off to the side of the road and got out, thinking the bird may have been injured. As he approached the bird, it looked up at him. It still didn't fly away. As he knelt down next to the bird, it didn't fly away. As he stuck his hand out and extended his finger, the bird didn't fly away, but instead jumped on his finger and looked up at him. It made no sound and didn't look frightened at all. This wasn't a domestic bird. This was out on a back road and was a cardinal, which are extremely common in our area. My uncle stood and walked back to the truck, still thinking the bird may have had an injured wing, and intended to take it home and see about taking it to a vet. He got in his very old, very loud truck, and the entire time he drove home with the windows down, the bird stood there on his finger silently, only cocking its head every now and then. He got home and got out of the truck and knelt down again in his driveway, and the bird hopped off of his finger and took a few steps away from him. It turned around took one last look up at him, cocked its head back and forth, and flew away, perfectly fine. That day was exactly 1 year after my grandpa passed away. When I was in 5th or 6th grade, we lived off a street called Meandering Way. Where I live, we have an Air Force base in the city limits, so you'll see the large grey planes flying around from time to time. One day I was in the car with my mom and her boyfriend. I was in the back seat by myself, looking out the window at the trees. It was sunny blue sky. We were driving down Meandering Way when I noticed a huge grey plane through the trees. It was far too close to the ground, but there was no loud airplane sound. And it wasn't moving, it simply hung there in the air. I remember my eyes widening, thinking, as a 5th/6th grader, that it must be flying very slowly. It wasn't. I saw both sides of it in detail, because the street kept turning. I couldn't speak. It was one of the strangest things I've ever seen. A similar thing happened to me a few years ago. I was in the car with my aunt, and I noticed another grey plane flying in the distance, normal altitude and all. A formation of birds was behind it, but obviously much closer to me than the plane. I focused on that image, and noticed that the power lines, on the same street I was driving on, formed a strange kind of X in the sky, from my perspective. The plane was headed straight for it, and I faintly remember thinking, what if it disappeared? And then it did. I tried to ask my aunt if she saw it, but I couldn't speak. Just after that, the formation of birds flew into the X, and yes, they disappeared as well. Neither came out the other side as they should have. I checked the sky multiple times, moving my head around to get a different view of the sky. No plane, no birds. 2nd 8th grade, I went to a relatively small private school. A friend of mine there had the same first name, same initials, same birthday, born in the same hospital about an hour apart. We both played soccer and ended up going to neighboring high schools where we played and ended up wearing the same number, but none of that is a glitch. My little sister played for the girls team and the girls season was after the guys. It was my senior year and all my sports were over, so I decided to go watch my sister's game against the school my buddy ended up playing for. Their school is the oldest in the region and hence had far larger grounds than any of the other schools in the district. Huge field with well-groomed pitches throughout, but surrounded by tall grass. Parking was bad, so I parked around the backside, jumped the wall, and was trudging through the tall grass when a glint caught my eye. I bent down and picked up a class ring with my initials, my year, my sport, and my number, but the crest of the school I was visiting. I picked it up and compared it to its near copy on my hand. It was such a strange feeling then, and even now as I type this it feels strange. I knew in a fraction of a second who this little chunk of metal belonged to, and the odds of anyone being able to find this ring in waist tall grass that is rarely if ever mowed, and that person being from a neighboring city, and being me of all people, will never cease to amaze me. The odds are unreal. I called him up and told him. He wouldn't believe me until it was in his hand. Apparently he'd lost it weeks before and was too afraid to tell his parents. Didn't see him again for about 10 years until we randomly ran into each other outside a bar. He was stumble drunk. Super responsible dude with a beautiful family, probably just out reliving the glory days 1-2 times a year. Don't judge. But the second he saw me he stumbled up, hung his arm over my shoulder and said, "I can't fucking believe you found my ring." All I could say was, "I know man, crazy," but I knew exactly what he was feeling. We were never really close, but there always seemed to be some glitch in the matrix where the mundane details of one of our lives buffer overflowed into the declarations of the other's life in the source of the matrix. This might be a glitch. So my parents had a home built in South America. They want to retire there and built it large enough for me and my kids to visit. The neighborhood is sparse. There are only 3 homes in the neighborhood, ours included. The rest are plots of land at that time. A little background. My dad has cancer and heart issues, so he doesn't go to the 2nd floor because it wears him out. I have 2 sons. The eldest sleeps in my parents' bedroom. The youngest sleeps in my room. My floor, there are 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. All the flooring in the house is tiled. You can really hear when someone uses the stairs. When we toured the newly finished house, we made sure to check if anything needed fixing. One night, I'm carrying my son up to our room because my mom and son fell asleep in their room. My dad is lying down in the room unable to sleep. Once I put my son to bed upstairs, I grab a book to do my nightly reading. Later on, I start to hear voices outside my bedroom and the hallway. The voices don't sound familiar. I'm scared and try to summon the courage to open the door. I didn't think it was a burglar because we had the alarm on, have a high wild fence with electric wire on top, and we religiously lock all doors and windows in the evening. I opened the door and the talking stops. I turned on all the lights, the hallway, and both kids' bedrooms. I check each room, turn off the lights, and close each door. Nothing is there. I come back to my room and the whispering continues. I locked my bedroom door and put some white noise to go to sleep. One night, I got creeped out. The door to Henry's bedroom is open and the lights are off, and it sounds like people whispering. My dad comes upstairs to give my son the oatmeal drink he made for him. And he goes to check Henry's room and closes the door for me. Different night. Everyone is asleep. I'm on my laptop in bed. It starts to rain sometime after midnight. I can see the rain outside my window. It's really dark outside and I can hear the rain pelting the roof. All of a sudden I feel an earthquake. I pick up my sleeping toddler and go to the bathroom doorway to wait out the earthquake. Once it stops, I put my son back in bed and look up any earthquakes reported recently. The website I go to has real-time earthquake reports. No earthquakes listed for the country I'm in. Thinking wow, that is strange, I drift off to sleep. Wake up, surprised the ground is dry. Talk to my parents about what happened. They said they didn't feel a thing and that it hasn't rained in days. One more odd thing. After a few weeks down there, my husband joins us. I give him a tour of the house. I tell him to make sure all the doors on our floor at night are closed. He does this. 2 weeks in, he comes to me confused and asked where the door went for Henry's bedroom. I'm also confused and go with him. There is no door there. I look at our bedroom door and see where it's screwed into the door frame. If the door had been taken out, then there would be holes where the screws used to be. There are no holes in Henry's door frame. I talk to my parents. They recall closing the door to Henry's room. According to the contractor, there was never a door there. All of us could swear there had been a door there. We each remember closing the door several times during our vacation. It's just a bunch of weird little things. At one point, I started thinking maybe the whispering were ghosts. But this is a new home in an area where it was all countryside. Unless it's something following us. Back when we lived in California, there was a shadow man with a hat that would appear only in our living room. My family visited us and stayed in my room. She thought she saw ghosts in my room and preferred sleeping in our living room during her stay. The current home in the US supposedly is haunted. Never seen anything but heard thing. Like when we remodeled the kitchen. Me and the kids were asleep together in my locked bedroom. Hubby came in from his night shift and goes upstairs to shower. Here's someone in high heels walking in the kitchen, opening and closing the drawers. We have the soft close drawers. Realizes the bedroom is locked. Comes in and saw we were all asleep. Sorry for the long post. Body randomly going on autopilot. There are times as an IT/CS student that I have these months that we call a death march, basically a grind month for final projects and proposals, 3 to 5 days with only a total of 5 hours sleep, and needing to be a functional student at the same time sometimes leaves gaps on my memory. It's like I only start to know things I've done when I've seen the result. An example would be me taking an exam for one of our minor subjects, instead of me remembering that I was taking the exam. I didn't even know I took the exam in the first place and just completely forgot that the exam even existed until a few days later when the test papers were released, and then I started to remember things such as answering questions and having trouble answering a particular number. It was as if I was downloading missing information in small increments. Happens with my proposal projects as well. Just randomly catch myself in front of a panel not knowing what I was doing and just pausing for a few seconds to see what's on the projector, and information suddenly starts flowing in and I start to figure out what the hell I was doing. It's like some weird syncing thing. Sometimes I scare myself with the sheet I recall after a week. With only 510 hours of sleep. I do so many things at once that maybe my body just leaves my consciousness to rest and a sheet by reflex. These only happen regularly when I'm very deprived though, so it might just be some cognition loss. Still scary to randomly be writing an essay at 4 AM and suddenly jump to 2 PM in front of a judge panel for a program proposal you somehow build between 7 and 12 PM. I've gotten so freaked out about this that I've often kept track of hours instead of actual time. Whenever I see myself going into a death march-esque scenario, I start my phone timer to see how many hours I've jumped or lost, and recently made it a habit to make sticky notes on my desktop and time checks when I do things. This happened to my aunt, and I'm a little skeptical, but here it is. When she was younger, this probably happened around the late 70s or early 80s. She had accompanied her friend, Danny, who was working late in an administrative building. My aunt, being the curious woman she is, began to wander the halls out of sheer boredom and came upon these stairs that led up to an open attic. So she climbed the stairs and entered the attic. Once up there, she saw that the walls were lined with bookshelves and there were old children's toys. We are talking like 19th century, scattered across the floor. One thing that stood out in particular was this black book that was laying in the middle of it all, as if waiting for her to pick it up. She said that she felt as if something was trying to get her to go over and open the book, but she had a bad feeling about it, so she decided not to and left to go ask her friend what all of this was to begin with. She was wondering why there would be toys in an administrative building. After having explained the situation to Danny, Danny simply asked what set of stairs she was even talking about, and my aunt explained the set that led up to this attic. Danny claimed that whatever my aunt was describing was impossible because there's a bunch of boxes filled with office supplies and other sheet blocking said set of stairs, and that the attic itself is locked as well as blocked off because of the boxes. My aunt would have had to physically remove all that sheet to even get near the attic. My aunt explained, thinking Danny still didn't get it, explained that she had literally just walked up the stairs and that the door to the attic was wide open, no boxes, no lock, nothing. So Danny, convinced my aunt was wrong, asked her to show her the set of stairs. And my aunt, determined to prove Danny wrong, walked her down the balls to the spot she found the barren stairs and open attic. When they arrived, my aunt was confused as hell, because just as Danny had described, there were the boxes full of office supplies, stacked upon each other, and blocking off the entrance to the attic. And the attic itself was padlocked and had chains across it, so there's no way it could have been open. My aunt continued to claim that sheet was literally not there before, and Danny proceeded to ask my aunt how high she was or if she had any drinks prior to coming. Of course, my aunt claimed she was completely sober and her mind was totally clear, so she hasn't been able to explain what went on that night since. This one happened to me a week after I suffered an acute ischemic stroke. This left me with some permanent vision loss that makes images burn white rainbows on the upper left quadrant, not unlike migraine auras, and some damage to my temporal lobe, which I do believe is the memory center my roommate had just bought in Xbox One and Fallout 4. And after a pretty stressful stay in the hospital, I wanted to wind down with some post-apocalyptic mayhem. After hours of perfect a face I'd rarely ever look at again, and a tutorial that actually called me by my first name, which was a great addition to the game, I was free to wander the wasteland point arising from the depths of the vault into the bright glare of daylight. I decided to do what I always do, ignore the main plot and run amok. So, naturally, instead of walking my way towards Sanctuary Hills, I ran the opposite direction. This is where everything went a little sideways. I started rounding a corner and immediately felt like I had been here before. I knew that just beyond the path right over the hill there would be a derelict building on my right with a couple dogs waiting to eviscerate me. Butterflies in my stomach made me want to move forward, but the fear of dying made me cautious, like I'd never find out where this path led. I know I used a vague description, but the building was vivid in my mind, and when I began to crest the hill, the hair stood up on the back of my neck as the same image began to paint itself before me, the only difference being there were no dogs, so I ran on point. This feeling continued with each turn, and the further I went, the more terrified of dying I became. It was as if this were actually me, and just past the next hill was the very thing I needed to reach to complete my mission. Out of the blue I heard a bark and growl from a pack of dogs sprinting up from behind me, as if they had stalked me from the very place I had envisioned them. My heart leapt, and I started sprinting, panicked for my life, trying my damnedest to just make it over that hill, to see what it was that was calling to me. A couple yards short of the mark, they caught up and as sure as day tore me asunder. I felt my heart sink, as if I lost my reason to ever play again. Since then I have never been able to find what path I took. The most likely thing being it was some sort of deja vu short-term / long-term memory cross chatter, but a little part of me still wonders what would have happened had I made it over that hill. TLDR, had a stroke, played Fallout 4, knew what was coming next as I wandered, felt like it was important that I make it to a certain place. Dogs I expected to kill me showed up and killed me. I drive about 50 kilometers to work every day, and I drive through 3 local councils, the one I live in, the fringe of one that has about 5 kilometers of highway in it, and the council my work is in. One morning I left home, drive past the kids, play equipment a block or so from my house, noticed the really long grass, and said to my wife next to me, they need to mow that grass, it's got to be a breeding ground for mozzies. Continuing along, get onto the highway, and go past one of those enormous next exit 2 kilometers signs that was hanging crooked by one bolt, and said, man, that sign's gonna come loose in the wind, I hope they fix that soon. I get into the town where I work, and just as I'm about to get onto the very narrow bridge to cross the river there is this motherfucker of a pothole right where the left wheels roll, and to miss it, you'd probably hit the side rail, or be in the path of oncoming traffic. I swore and said yep, this also needs to be fixed ASAP. What the fuck is going on today? The country is falling apart. Wife laughs at how stupidly observant I'm today, and we think nothing else of it. The very next day, on the way in we pass about 6 blokes working on the grass and weeds at the play equipment, to cherry pickers with guys working on the highway sign, and an asphalt truck and a few guys filling in the giant pothole. I've tried to invoke the council workers again a few times when I've seen rundown sheet around the area, but nothing has ever come of it. So I guess you could consider my ability to see the source code and assign debuggers a decent glitch in the matrix. Either that or my very own Truman moment in case I don't see ya. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. I almost forgot about this until I was reading some people's comments on dreaming events before they happen. When I was in 4th grade, on a Tuesday night, I went to bed. I woke up, went to school, and had a normal school day as usual. We learned about multiplication / division on flashcards. We were studying for a test that would be on Friday. I had other subjects too, but that I remembered strongly. I went home, had a normal rest of the day, ate dinner, and went to bed. I woke up the next morning thinking it was Thursday. Everyone kept saying, no, it's Wednesday. I was like, it most definitely is not, it is Thursday. And then I think I saw it on the morning news or something and gasped. How could it be Wednesday? And then the day happened, again. Exactly as it had happened the first time. Everyone said the same things. People in the halls walking the same path. I guess that's not that weird, since they'd probably do that anyway, but I mean it was the exact same. Oddly enough, I didn't really notice everything was the exact same until we got to math class and my teacher brought out the flashcards to study for the math test. We did this already, I said. Did we? She asked the class. They all responded that no, we hadn't. She started doing the flashcards one by one. They were in the same exact order they had been in the day before. We did this already, I pleaded, kind of annoyed that no one seemed to remember we did this already. The next card you pick up is going to say 6x4. And she picked up the card, and it did say 6x4. And everyone in the classroom looked at me like I was a she-devil. I hated being stared at, so I decided to just keep my mouth shut the rest of the class. It wasn't until I had gone over the events for the day that I realized what had happened. I had gone to bed, then dreamed getting up, going to school, my entire day, and then going back to bed in a dream. It was one of the most ridiculous things that has ever happened to me. Definitely a glitch in the time matrix. My first apartment away from home was a downstairs apartment in a building with 8 units. My roommate failed to extinguish the charcoal one night, and it's molded in the mulch next to the apartment all night. We came home for lunch the next day, worked at the same place, and there was a hole burned in the side of our unit. We went in and there was a note from the fire dep saying they'd been in there to extinguish the fire. Had a case number and all that on there. So we are looking around and notice our weed and all our paraphernalia laying around and kinda start freaking out. It's about this time the landlord comes and tells us we are being kicked out. We didn't protest because it was our fault and we were just glad nobody arrested us for the weed point. So we are moving out, and our upstairs neighbor, whom we smoked with often, came down and was kinda just bullshitting with us. He says something like, "I don't know why you guys would want to live here anyway," and that got us both interested. He told us there was a double murder in the apartment, and when we rented it, it has sat vacant for about 4 months before we showed up. That creeped the shit out of both of us, because some weird shit had happened while we were there. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in a multiverse and glitches in the Matrix point. So we make a run to the new apartment, leaving a bookshelf and my ball python, Don, for the last run. We locked the place up and made the run and came back to get the last of the stuff. When we walked in, Don's enclosure was in the middle of the room with the lid removed, and the books on the bookshelf were piled around it in a perfect spiral shingle, one on top of the other, pattern. What you have to realize is that Don had spent every waking moment of the previous 6 years trying to escape that enclosure. Now it was sitting in the middle of an empty room with no lid on it, and he was curled up in the corner and wouldn't move. He wouldn't uncoil himself for several days, to the point I thought he was sick. And we weren't gone long enough for someone to build a perfect Tolkien roof out of books around the enclosure point. Like I said, I don't believe in ghosts, and by most accounts I'm a skeptic. But that was too weird. Still the only thing like that's ever happened to me. This just happened today, and I should probably make a post on r/nolep about it, but it isn't a very long story. I just drove 7 hours back to college, and whenever I go on really long drives I get a bad case of highway hypnosis, so this could all just be my brain getting confused. I was on a really long stretch of farm road, where there were maybe 3 other cars, all a good distance away from me. Eventually, one of the cars moves into the left lane to pass me. When he passes, I notice he has the same model and color of car as me. Not a big deal, it's a popular model. It's just something I noticed, since I'm so used to seeing my own car. But I take a look at the license plate, and it is exactly the same as mine. Same letters, numbers, and state. I was beyond confused, and at first I thought I'm pretty sure duplicate license plates don't exist like that. I didn't consider any glitch in the Matrix type stuff. I just thought it was odd, and that I was confused from a long and mind-numbing drive. Anyway, after getting quite a bit further ahead of me, the copycat car moved back into the right lane, put its hazards on, and pulled over onto the side of the road. I just kept on driving and thinking about how odd it was, but after another hour or so of more endless farm road, my mind drifted off somewhere else. Another hour or so later, I'm getting closer to campus, but I'm still on that same damn stretch of road. You probably see where this is going. I've got cruise control set a good deal above the speed limit, since there are no cops around, and I'm already behind schedule due to some heavy construction early on in my drive. As I'm going over a hill, I notice that I'm approaching another car pretty quickly, so I switch to the left lane. At that point, I realize it's the same copycat car I saw earlier. Or at least, I thought it was. I remember back to when I last saw it, and I realize I'm doing exactly the same thing I saw the copycat car do earlier, passing a car that looks exactly like it, and has the same plates. My head starts spinning, and I'm thoroughly shaken at this point. I just don't understand what's going on. By now I'm a good deal ahead of this car, and up on a hill. So although I'm trying to make out the face of the driver, I can't see it past his sun visor. Important note, I also had my sun visor down the entire length of this road. I remembered that, when the copycat car had passed me, it pulled over on the side of the road. At this point, I've thrown all logic out the window and I wholeheartedly believe that I have just encountered a past version of myself, and I decided to pull over on the side of the road, both because I want to see if I can get a look at the driver's face, and because I feel like that's what I'm supposed to do, since I witnessed other me do it. Once I pulled over, this guy zoomed past me. I didn't get a very good look at him, but I saw that he was wearing a green shirt just like I was. I just sat on the side of the road for a while after that. I was incredibly weirded out, and I took time to lower my heart rate. I don't have a very strong heart due to medical issues and I get faint if I get too anxious. All of this seems like too much of a coincidence. All other evidence aside, there's no way two cars would have the same license plate, especially not on the exact same type of car. I don't know what to think. I've never believed much in these types of things, but the only other explanation is that I was extremely foggy from such a monotonous drive and my brain was looking for stimulation. Although I definitely was foggy, I've never had an issue of seeing strange hallucinations because of long drives. It was a harmless, but absolutely terrifying experience, and I wish I knew more about what the fuck happened. TLDR, a car that looked just like mine passed me on a ridiculously long road, and I later passed a car that looked just like mine in the exact manner. Driver was wearing the same color shirt as me. Didn't see his face. Keep in mind, the year is a little important on this one. I've done a lot of looking into the Mandela effect and alternate realities and shit, so this one is always fun for me to tell, even though I've only told 3 people. I watched a movie while visiting my mom for the summer, lived with dad in Utah 4 years, only saw my mom on summer break from school each year, who I currently live with. I remember a lot of it clear as day, sitting on the chairs we used to have here, my mom's clam dip sitting on the footstool between me, my mom, and my brother. We all loved the movie, laughed together. Eggsy is looking through the weapons cabinet, grabs a lighter, that's a taser or something. Other guy kicks his foot, knife comes out of his shoe, blah blah. This all happened in 2011. Fast forward to 2014. I moved in with my mom. She asks if I want to watch this new movie called The Kingsman, Secret Service. Sure, ma, why not? We sit down, start watching it. We saw this already, with brother. I remember all of this. She then tells me this movie just came out. I argue little. No, we've seen it together. I look it up. Kingsman Secret Service release date, 2014. You really don't remember us all watching this movie together 3 years ago, mom? We couldn't have. It just came out, the whole movie. Every scene, every line, every emotion. I'd seen it all before. 3 years earlier. It was all like deja vu to me. But my mom didn't remember any of it, and the movie was released in 2014, not 2011. I haven't asked my brother if he remembers it, but I've searched as far and wide as I can with Google, and as far as I'm aware I'm the only one who's seen the movie before 2014. But it's one of few things I remember as clearly as I do, and I have no doubt in my mind that it's not a mistaken memory. The night my grandma passed away, we were all at home with her, because we knew that she didn't have long. The doctor discharged her from the hospital the day prior, and told us to be prepared. I remembered being on the computer in the living room, when my aunt walked out into the hallway, and told us that my grandma has passed. We then called the funeral home, and our relatives living in the area, to come over to pay our respect and to help preparing the house. We covered up the mirrors and took out the beddings from my grandma's room. After all that was done and prayers were said, we all went to sleep. My grandma appeared in my dream that night, sitting on the chair that she normally sat at, and it was just like any other day when she was still alive, except I remembered feeling pretty strange because I knew she wasn't there anymore. I got woken up from that dream along with the rest of my family members because we all heard the sound of a dish or a plate being dropped in the living room. We all ran out of our rooms to see a half broken plate on the floor with the other half still sitting on the altar. Towards the end of my grandma's life, she couldn't really walk normally anymore because of her arthritis, so my family got her this electronic doorbell with a button that she could press to call us when she needs something. We had to get rid of the bell after my grandma passed away because it goes off by itself, even when we leave it inside the cabinet. I have a few. I've been trying to notice when this happens, but I forget most of them. My first ever festival was also my first time encountering people on mushrooms. I had never tried them myself, but we had a discussion about time loops that day. That night I had a very vivid dream about my friend telling me that the fire from the burning man had spread to the tents and she was going to help put out the fire. I live in Australia, so I assumed it wouldn't happen. I also thought it was weird I wouldn't have helped, but sure enough, we went to the Burning Seed Festival, Australian Burning Man, and I was hanging out with some people who gave me mushrooms for the first time for the burning of the effigy. As I'm wandering around off my tigs, my friend comes up and says the fire has spread to the tents and she was helping. I was way too high for that shit and just carried on with it. Also once I was with my mum in a Macca's parking lot and said, "Mum, I've been here before," and she said, "Yes, you probably have." And I said, "No, I mean there's a man in a striped shirt behind us." And sure enough he turned the corner as we turned to look. The other one I remember was once in year 7 my friend said, "You will never guess what I have to show you." And I said, "Is it a black and white photo of Adam Young?" And she just looked at me gobsmacked, but showed me anyway. My brother-in-law was killed in a horrific accident on October 4th. 2001, while leaving a job location. He burned to death, so it was a closed casket of course. A few weeks after his funeral he began coming to me in dreams. One day in May 2003, my mom wakes me up around 4 AM to go sleep in her bedroom as she was headed out to work. My dad had already left to work. I go to her bedroom and fall back asleep right away. I start dreaming. My brother-in-law comes to me and tells me to get up and lock the back door. I know it's a dream and I tell him I'm too sleepy to get up. He yells at me to get up and lock the back door now because someone is coming for me. I wake up and run to the back door. It's unlocked. I lock it, and as soon as I lay on the bed, no less than a minute later, I hear someone at the back door trying to open it. My heart dropped. He began kicking my door, and me being a scared and dumb 13-year-old, I call my mom and tell her someone's trying to break into the home. She yells for me to call the cops, so I hang up on her and call the cops. At this time, my dog Soma is standing at the window wagging her tail and I'm whispering at her as to come to me so we can hide. I stay on the phone with the dispatcher as this person is trying to kick the back door down. The dispatcher tells me to look out the window and see if I see the cops. I look out, and the person is standing at the window looking back at me. My heart fell into my ass. That moment scared me shitless. I tell the dispatcher that I know who that person. He lives down the street and his brother is my very good friend. While I'm telling dispatch this, my mom pulls up on the side of the house and her headlights shine a light on him. Then the cops are walking from the front of the house to the back when they see the guy, and the guy sees them and books it for the alley. Guy got caught. Turns out he had been stalking me for 6 months and tells the cops he planned to rap me and impregnate me. I had to testify in court and he was sent to a tight place until he was 18. He was 14 or 15 when the crime took place. Since my brother-in-law passed, he has saved my life 3 times. He comes to me when he needs to tell me something, or he needs me to pass a message to his mom, my sister or my nephews. Odd to say, but I have a better relationship with him now than I did when he was alive. My brother-in-law is my guardian angel. TLDR, dead brother-in-law comes to me in dream, warns me and saves my life. Has saved my life 3 times since passing on. Had 2 very specific dreams involving car accidents of family/close family friends. Dream I was in the middle of the backseat of my eldest sister's Sandy Pontiac's on fire. It was a fairly gloomy just rain day. Sandy was driving and my middle sister, Kathy, was in the passenger seat. I looked out to the left and there was a cyclist and we were approaching a T intersection. I told Sandy to watch out for the cyclist, and just as I said that, we drove through the intersection and a car came out of nowhere and T-boned Sandy's car on the passenger side. Sandy and I exited the vehicle while Kathy stayed put as she had injured her hip and leg. We walked over to the guy who hit Sandy's car. He had shoulder-length brown hair and a long black trench coat with angel wings embroidered all the way from the top to the bottom. He was also super tall, like 6 feet 4 inches. Point awake. I didn't tell Sandy It was a weird dream, and though I have never forgotten it, it's been over a decade, I didn't think it was significant to share. A week later, on a wet day, Sandy gets T-boned at a T intersection by a guy who ran the light. Sandy's boyfriend was in the passenger seat and had a severely bruised hip and leg after. This may sound like I have let the details influence my memory, but when me and Sandy were talking about it that night, she only said, "The guy." I asked if his appearance was the same as my dream, and it was all the same, except the embroidered angel wings dream. I was in the middle of the backseat of Kathy's best friend's, Hallie, car in the evening. Hallie was acting weird, driving sporadically, and as we were rounding a smooth curve, she drove off the road and hit a light pole on the passenger side. Kathy, who was in the passenger seat, was killed immediately. Point awake the next morning, I told Kathy about my dream, having learned from the last time. This was barely a year later. 2 weeks go by, nothing happens, but then Kathy gets a call telling her that Hal has been in a really bad car accident. Her boyfriend, who was the passenger, had been killed. Hallie was driving drunk. Haven't had a dream like that since, and I freaking hope I never do again. I think the second dream was less detailed than the first, because Hallie isn't related to me. Dunno why Kathy was in both dreams, when she wasn't in either accident, though. I have a few to share. Some are terrifying, and some are interesting in a very mundane way. Doppelgänger. Can't recall how old I was at the time, but I was young. My bedroom at the time was just off the living room in a glorified storage room that had been turned into a bedroom, with my dad installing a hanging bed off the studs in the wall to give me play space. If you did not walk into my room and continued straight, you would be in the solarium that had a seldom used door to the outside and a small basement under a large and oddly shaped trapdoor. One day, while playing quietly in my room up on the bed frame, I saw my mom walk by and go into the solarium. I called out to her several times, but she took no notice of me. Annoyed at being ignored, I climbed down the ladder and walked into the solarium. No one was there. I checked the basement and the light was off and no one was in there. I unlocked the seldom used door and checked the perimeter of the house. No one was there. So I walked upstairs to my parents' bedroom. She was napping, in completely different clothes. She was rather confused when I asked her if she had been downstairs or sleepwalking, but she has never sleepwalked. Shadow dimension, same bedroom. Nighttime. At this point my bed was down below, and I used the hanging bed frame as a play area. I was always scared of the dark when I was a kid, and had many reasons to be. I awoke in the middle of the night, as I often did, and upon waking, made a little hole in the covers to peer out of. I swept the room and immediately noticed that my rolling toy storage unit was no longer covered in toys on top. No other toys were present and only basic furniture was present via silhouettes. I thought this was strange, and then I saw them at my door. 3 humanoid shapes were noiselessly struggling with each other in some sort of battle. I froze with shock as the dim moonlight from the window lit up the room enough to allow me to see them. The most human looking one hit one of the others very hard, and it was sent flying towards my bed. I closed the spy hole and my eyes in anticipation of an impact that never came. I quickly opened the spy hole again and peered out as to why nothing had made contact. Well, it had made contact. It was pissed. As it stood up slowly, I got a good look at the shape of its head and ears with 2 little stumps on either side of the top of its head. As soon as it had righted itself, it dashed back into the fray with inhuman speed. I noped back under my covers and made myself go back to sleep. About a year or 2 ago I was perusing a similar Reddit thread and ended up googling apparition. One of the images on Google, save for the horn stubs, was the exact thing I saw all those years ago. Everything in my memory clicked, and I was awash with cold, gripping fear, and tears fell from my eyes in sheer terror. I don't live in an area where they're supposed to be. Some of us are trying to sleep around here. After we first moved into that house, my bedroom was across from my parents' room. One night I was jolted awake as I heard an incredibly evil and loud cackling from a female voice. My parents heard nothing. Who are you? I was at school in winter. The recess bell had rung for us to go back inside, and I was the very last person out in the yard. I walked past a double-paned window, and out of the corner of my eye saw a shape the same size and dimensions as myself following behind me in the reflection. I whirled around and nothing was there. I tried to get the image to reappear by walking past the window several more times. Nothing. Point phases driving. My mom picked up myself and my 3 step siblings from our bus stop and was driving us back home in our old big brown van. It was winter and one of the corners was notoriously sharp. As we rounded the corner, a large cargo truck was rounding the corner and was in our lane. It was too late. We went right through him and pulled over, and he kept driving despite initially braking. No one was hurt and no collision had taken place. We checked the tracks of both vehicles in the formerly fresh snow and the van's left tire track was in between the truck's tracks. We phased right through, unscathed. Sleep paralysis. At the last house my parents owned before separating, I found myself lying in bed on my back as I woke mid-sleep. I can't sleep on my back unless I'm in a chair. I thought this was strange and went to shift over onto my side. I couldn't move. Just my eyelids and eyes could move. I felt restrained, but there was something pulling me back, not pushing me down. At the foot of my bed stood a man in a long coat, entirely black with no defining features other than slim. He was shrouded in darkness, but matched a description of man my mom had seen many years earlier out of the corner of her eye, but was not there when she looked directly where he should have been. As soon as I saw him in the shroud, I knew who he was. I knew it was him holding me to the bed as I struggled against his invisible restraints. I could feel my muscles desperately trying to break free as my back broke out in sweat from the strain. I could not open my mouth to send the dark fiend packing, so I remembered something my religious parents had told me to say: if I thought there was a dark force near me, I rebuke you in the name of my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Nothing else was working, so why the hell not? I tried to form the words in my mind and slipped, so I directed them at him and aggressively restated the phrase mentally. He receded into his shroud and through a dark portal behind him. I immediately sat up as fast as possible. The room was normal, but I was sore and my back was drenched with sweat. If that was sleep paralysis, it was a nasty case of it. It has never happened since point miscellaneous. Have had multi-level deja vu on multiple occasions at work of repeating events. I have come to ignore them, even though they happen in the exact same way in the exact same place at completely different points in time. Similar episodes have happened where the events did not take place previously, and yet I remember them vividly. These ones are not limited to work. I've worked between 2 stores, same company, for the past 7+ years, and at one of them, anytime I thought of someone I knew they would arrive at the store within 2 minutes. Every single time point I've found I can predict small things such as specific words, usually singular, seconds before they are uttered by the other person. It's as if I hear them before they say anything. Though I think this one has a scientific explanation. Point I once had a dream as a child that spanned 3 full days. I woke up on the 48th day and asked my mom about the previous day. She had no idea what I was talking about, and despite her being very present in my dream, those days had never happened. I can still recall a small portion of one of the days I once was working so much that I worked, got home, went to sleep, worked another full shift in my dream, and sum up extremely exhausted, only to go to work again for a full shift. 3 shifts in a 24-hour period sucks. There's more, but I'm tired. I have to pee, and I have stuff to do tomorrow before work. Good night, folks. Don't expect this to be seen, but wanted to share it anyway. I'm not used to writing these things down, so please bear with me. Point about 15 years ago on a Friday night I was riding around the back roads with my cousin and another friend. We had spent the day cleaning up trash at the flea market and were just out late trying to get ourselves lost on roads we didn't normally use. Point we were driving his vehicle and decided to pull over beside an abandoned farmhouse to roll a joint. I took over driving while he sat in the passenger seat. The truck was still running and I had the headlights off. Once he finished his handiwork he gave me the okay to go, so I turned on the headlights. I put it in drive, and after only a few feet of movement the truck just died. Everything stopped working: lights, radio, engine, brakes, everything. He's a mechanic and hadn't had any issues with his truck for quite a while, and we were all surprised that it happened at all. Point while we were discussing what to do he opened his door to get out and told me to pop the hood. Before I could hit the release the truck started back up on its own. The headlights came back on, and the radio did as well. It was still playing the same song like nothing had went wrong. He got back in. We shrugged it off and got back on the road. I remember feeling incredibly strange, and both of them noticed they felt odd as well. While we were talking about it, our friend's phone started ringing. It was his girlfriend, worried sick about him because he hadn't come home yet. He asked her why she would be worried because he said he'd be home sometime around 1 am. It was almost 4 am and we were still within eyesight of the house we stopped in front of. We lost around 3.5 hours of time on that road and to this day have no idea what happened. We took our friend straight home to his frantic so, and my cousin and I spent the rest of the night driving around seeing if it would happen again. TLDR, lost time on an old country road. When I was young, like grade 6, I dreamed about a time where I was sitting on my bed in my basement bedroom. I was pulling something from my Bo Jackson backpack, and I wasn't sure why, just seemed like the thing to do. And as I was doing it, my pencil case fell out, and my pencil crayons all fell onto my bed, except my green and orange one fell on the floor. I instinctively knew my mother was going to walk past my window, so I looked up to that window to hear her ask if my sister started supper. I said yes. Now, this may not seem significant, except when I was in grade 6 and had this very vivid dream, it wasn't of a place that I recognized. These events of this dream actually transpired when I was in grade 9. I only remembered my dream as the events started to unfold as I sat on my bed. Then, things were almost automatic. I knew how things were going to play out, and it was like I was forced into an observation mode. The dumping of the backpack, no idea why I did it. The order of the pencils, all fell out the same. Me knowing my mother was coming to look up and know to anticipate her question. All of exactly like my dream. It felt like my awareness of my dream forced it to play out that way. This wasn't the first time this has happened in my life. But usually when it does, something is off, typically near the end. Or if it's bang on, the majority of the time, I'm not given the luxury of lots of time to connect my dream to what is happening in the moment. That period of knowledge of what is about to happen is at maximum 1 second. Except in this case it was long enough where I had plenty of time to change my actions, but totally did not. The other strange thing in this case is that it was in a totally different house, 3 provinces over. I didn't recognize the house. Usually this happens in places I'm familiar with. There was only one other occasion where that wasn't true, and that happened about 8 years later. Way late to the party, but here it goes. When I was really little, like 4, 6, my mom had this porcelain cat that rested on its side and had a little cup thing in its back to put stuff in it. I played with it a few times, but couldn't anymore since my mom placed it on our upstairs hallway cabinet. Now the weird part. One night I was up in the middle of the night and was in the hallway going to the bathroom or something. The next thing I knew, everything started getting blurry and weird. As a kid I didn't know better and just kind of went with it. Then I saw the cat statue rise into the air and float around above my head, leaving behind a wispy trail of grey/white behind it. This went on for a few moments. It then slowly glided into my parents' bedroom and settled itself in the middle of their mantle. Their mantle was much too high for me to reach, so it could not have been me. After that I do not remember what happened, but shortly thereafter I woke up the next morning and went into my parents' bedroom because I had a nightmare, and there it was, on their mantle. I do not believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but I found it to be pretty weird. Around the same time in my life my sister had this creepy picture of Raggedy Andy and Raggedy Ann in her bedroom. Not sure if it was legit those characters, but when I was little I thought it was the creepiest thing. Having yarn hair and buttoned eyes was so eerie. One night I went into my sister's bedroom to sleep in her bed and I saw the picture move. I looked at it and saw them moving their heads and bodies in like a slow motion type of deal, like in those movies from the 80s where they do that teleporting slow mo thing. Scared the shit out of me, and I never trusted that picture again. I told my mom and she took it down. I suppose the last time I can recall something weird is when I had a fever when I was in my early teens. I was on my couch feeling like shit, tired, groggy, the works, and I saw my sister walk through the living room and I started talking to her and we chatted for about 30 minutes. Then I took a nap because I was sick. When I awoke it was after 3 p.m. and everyone was coming back from school and I saw my sister come in the door. I said, "Hey Bob, not a real name, what were you doing at home earlier?" She said she wasn't. Apparently I had a 30-minute conversation with a hallucination. Or there is a good chance that house was haunted. I can't tell if this is a Matrix glitch or just ghostly sheet. But when I was younger I was having an afternoon snack in the kitchen and my mom was cooking dinner. Her cell phone rang and she left the room to answer it. At the same time the house phone rang. I called for my mom, but she didn't come, so I answered it. On the other end of the line was my aunt. I spoke to her, and I remember her asking me what I wanted for my birthday, which either was weird cause it was March and my birthday wouldn't have been for another 5 months. So I asked her for a Gamma Boy Advanced SP. She said, "I'll make sure your mom gets you one," and she said, "I can't wait for your mom. I have to go. Tell her I love her, and we'll talk soon." We hung up, and I went about my business. My mom come back into the room and turns off the stove and she's crying. And I blurt out, "Titty Merced's just called." And my mom looked like she was going to pass out. She asked me what did I say. And I told her Titty called and told her that she loves her and they'll talk soon. And my mom then told me that the call she got was from her cousin telling her that Merced's passed away. My mom was super freaked out but always comforted that she called to say goodbye. My brother 69 the most recent call, and it said the call could not be completed as dialed, but there was for sure a 3-minute phone call on the caller ID. I never told my mom about her asking me what I wanted for my birthday, but sure enough at my titty's funeral my mom gave me an USB to keep me busy. I asked her how did she know I wanted one, and she said, "I had a dream you asked for one for your birthday." It's so bizarre, and if someone told me this story I would call bullshit on it. But both my brothers were witnesses to the phone call, and when my mom gave me the Gamma Boy, both my brothers are older than me, so their memories are a little clearer than mine, but my middle brother gets upset on the anniversary of her death every year, because when I was on the phone I asked him if he wanted to say hi to her, and he said no, because he was in the middle of a game, and he still regrets it. This is late, and will surely get buried, but I'll share nonetheless. TLDR, my mom is having an affair with a ghost. This happened just a couple days ago on Friday, when I had to get up for school. Generally my brother and I get up at around 6:15, and are out the door by 7:25 for school. We were running a bit slow that day, and at 6:45 I heard my mom at the bottom of the stairs. My brother and I had rooms on the 3rd floor and my parents the 2nd, telling us to get up. She sounded wide awake, and it came clear as day. I got up a couple minutes later, and walked downstairs to figure out why she was up so early, as she generally sleeps in when she works from home. I poked my head into my parents' room, and saw that the light was on in the bathroom and the shower was running. I noticed someone was in bed and I assumed my dad was in the shower and my mom back in bed. I called out, "Mom?" And she sat up in bed, and in a super sleepy and dreary voice she said, "Yeah." I apologized for sleeping in, and went to shower. Now none of this is weird, and it was just a standard morning for our family. It didn't get weird until Saturday during dinner. My mom brought up us waking up late on Friday. I mentioned that it was strange how she sounded wide awake 1 minute, and was dead asleep the next. She said she didn't know what I was talking about, and that she was awake before and after she woke us up. I said, "No, you were back in bed asleep and dad was in the shower." It's then when my dad says he was at the gym all morning and mom said she was in the shower when I called out to her and she answered. Now I know for a fact that a person sat up in my parents' bed and responded to me. I made eye contact with this thing and spoke to it, but I have no idea who or what it was. The whole thing freaked all of us out and further supports our belief that our house is haunted. Just posted this on r/glitch_and_the_matrix, but thought I would share here too. I was in high school, probably aged 15 or 16, and distinctly remembered being excited for the weekend. This was around 10 years ago now, so my later details and answers to comments may be hazy. That Friday at school was as normal and boring as they come, as I got myself ready for the weekend and a big rugby game I had been excited for all week. Nothing stands out as being unusual or special either at the time or now as I think back. The following day I was woken up by my phone's alarm. I remember being confused since my alarm was set to only ring Monday, Friday. I remember going back to sleep thinking it was a mistake only for my mum to wake me up for school. I remember being really confused and certain it was Saturday. I protested that it was Saturday before my mum started making fun of me for being a lazy teenager. Reluctantly I realized she wasn't joking and got ready for school thinking I had really messed up my mental calendar that week. I was so certain the day before was Friday. I remembered the order of lessons I had every Friday and recall carrying out that order the day before. The work was in my book to back that up, if I recall properly. I went through the day and had several occasions of deja vu. Note, #1 to me, it wasn't deja vu, since I genuinely believed I had lived that day out. #2 this was 10 years ago, so the deja vu may be more exaggerated in my memory than it actually was. Two notably examples that aren't exaggerated by my memory are the lunch lady giving me small talk while serving me my lunch and the history lesson at the end of the day. I remembered exactly what the lunch lady was going to say before she said it and her calling me rude for finishing her sentence. In the history lesson I remember knowing what the questions were before they were asked and then having the answers already written on the previous page in my book, which I had written the day before. This stands out in my memory because I recall asking my friends why we were doing the same lesson twice and him stressing out thinking he had missed a class. Silly as it sounds, I asked for something different for my tea that evening. To try and change the pattern. I went to bed that night and woke up on Saturday as expected. It has been a very long time since I thought about this, and I'm open to suggestions on what it could have been / shared similar experiences. TLDR, I'm convinced I repeated a regular boring school day yet didn't get a bonus to my class attendance record. My mom was 8 to 9 months pregnant with my sister. I went to sleep normal one day just like any other day. Suddenly, in the middle of the night I heard my mom yelling in pain. I got up and ran to the living room. She was going through labor. I was frantic going around the apartment and trying to get a phone to call an ambulance. Then I suddenly woke up. I thought, wow, that's crazy. I'm gonna tell my mom I dreamt of her having the baby. I got up and started walking around the apartment and couldn't find anyone. So I went to my phone to call her and saw a new message. It was a picture message of my baby sister who was born around 5 AM. Side note, my brother has a learning disability, but for the most part processes information just like anyone else. I live with my mom and stepdad. My biological dad lived in Mexico and I hadn't seen him since I was 3 years old. Around when I was 16 my dad found me on Facebook and started talking to me through there. He sounded like the typical dad who hasn't seen their kids in years and felt regretful. He asked me about my brother and if he had a Facebook, and I told him he didn't. My dad never knew my brother had a learning disability and was confused on why he didn't have a Facebook for someone his age. Anyways, fast forward to when I was about to turn 18 and my mom got a call saying my dad had been killed. She broke the news to me, but didn't tell my brother because she didn't know if he could even comprehend the news. My brother was about 6 months old the last time he had contact with my dad. Fast forward a few days later, and my brother started acting strange. He then said that he didn't want to sleep in his room at the time because he was hearing voices of a man trying to talk with him in the middle of the night. He was never told about my dad dying, so there's no way he could have made that up. A few days later a random lady added me on Facebook and started talking to me. Turns out she was my dad's widowed wife. She sent me paragraphs of texts talking about how my dad would always be talking about us and hoping we are doing okay, and that he felt regret and remorse about all the years he didn't talk, and how he could never put together the words to let us know how he felt. Late to the party, but wanna share anyway. Once I dreamed I was standing in a dock by a lake, and my family members were all swimming around. They noticed I was standing on the dock and all stopped to look at me. I jumped in, and everyone gasped, and I woke up. As soon as I hit the water very next day, my grandmother, whom I live with, and I were looking at old photo albums. One of them had a picture of my deceased grandfather standing on a dock on a lake that looked suspiciously like the one from my dream, since he died when I was 5. I never really knew him, but the picture was taken after his hematoma surgery, which he got due to throat cancer. My grandmother said I hate this picture. Every night after he got that hole in his neck up until he died, I had the same nightmare every night, that he fell off this dock and drowned, explaining that the hematoma would have caused him to drown almost instantly. Another time, I dreamed I ate one of those nutty bars, the wafers covered in chocolate, and as a result of it, my stomach was sick. In the dream, I remember having the thought in my dream I'm feeling sick because of that nutty bar. I hadn't eaten one in real life in years, but Granny had them in the fridge for herself. The next morning, when I woke up, I asked my grandmother how she slept, and she said not very good. I ate one of those nutty bars before bed last night, and it made me sick all night. I think my granny and I are connected in dreamland. I have a lot of social anxiety. Because of this I'm usually overly nice to everyone I meet, and it takes me a long while to get comfortable around people. Only twice in my life have I instantly hated people for no reason I can determine. The first was a guy my friend and I met at a party in high school. I was instantly rude to him, and even I didn't know why. Shortly after he started flirting with my friend, and I kept trying to tell her to stay away from him. Well, she didn't, and we ended up not talking for a week while she started dating him. Then, I get a phone call the following Saturday, and I see her number on the caller ID. I got this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach, and answered what did he do, and she was silent for a bit, and asked how did you know? Turns out he slipped something in her drink, and took her virginity. Rap. She was 15, he was 19 to 20. She wouldn't tell anyone, because her mom was super religious, and she was afraid of being disowned. Her mom actually kicked her out a year later, and she moved in with me for a while, because she found out she had such crazy people. The second was about 6 to 7 years later. I was 21, and shared a place with my 18-year-old sister. She had a friend who was 15 or 16 who pretty much stayed over every chance she got. One night I went out to a bar, and came home to see people I'd never met on my couch. My sister was a party person, and this wasn't unusual, though we argued about it. Well, this one guy instantly gave me bad vibes, and I was rude to him again for seemingly no reason. Ended up in a yelling match and I kicked the guy out. I went to bed shortly after. I got up the next morning, and went to get on my computer, which I kept in the guest room. Walk into that as in bed with the underage girl. Apparently he plied her with alcohol, and promised her a car, to have sex with him. I wanted to call the police, but he took off, and I had no info on him. Sister and girl knew his name, and where he lived, but refused to tell me. I called her mom and she wanted to press charges, but they lied, and claimed they had no info again. A few years later my sister let me know he was in jail for rapping a 14-year-old, and turned out his wife had left him at the time this happened, for sleeping with underage girls. He was in his late 30s when this happened. That was over a decade ago, and I haven't reacted that way since. I do get vibes from time to time, and I knew every time my ex cheated on me, though I stayed married to the guy for a decade. Apparently I have a sixth sense for sex with people that I feel is wrong. My college campus has very little parking near the dorms, so whenever a student appears to be walking to their car to leave, it's typical to follow them to ask if they are going to a car. Well, one night I was in the car with my friend, and we were coming back fairly late. We didn't think we had any hopes of finding a spot, but lo and behold, we turn in to see a guy coming out from between the dorms towards the parking lot. In the middle of the lot, there's a small circular grassy median with one tree on either side, surrounded by parking spots. The kid we saw walked towards the median, and as he stepped onto it, he turned back towards us, smiled, somewhat mischievously, and put up the hand motion to his face. I swing around to the other side of the median he was walking towards in hopes of taking his spot, but as I pass the tree, the kid seemingly vanishes. My friend and I were so spooked that we drove around the median 3 or 4 times looking into each of the parked cars. Very few cars had tinted windows, and the ones that did, we could see into the car from the front from the opposite side of the median as we drove around. And nothing. Every single one of those cars was empty, and there was no way he cold walked fast enough out of the parking lot without us seeing, or left one of the cars without us noticing. I still can't explain what happened to this day, but I'm halfway convinced we may have witnessed a human disappear. I've posted this before, but it fits this thread nicely. Point: in high school I had a friend, we'll call him John for these purposes. Me and John played football together, and we would always get extra lifting sessions in at the high school gym. We remained friends after high school and even worked together for a bit. He ended up getting into selling pills and our relationship deteriorated to the point we were no longer speaking. Fast forward a few years later, and I have this dream. In my dream, I'm back at my high school gym lifting weights with John. We were just chatting about random stuff, having a good time, and then he suddenly says that he has to go. I tell him I don't want him to leave because I want to keep hanging out and I missed him. He just says he's really sorry, but has to leave. I say okay, see ya later, and he replies with a nod and a see ya. I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. I see it as my mom and answer it. She tells me that John had died last night and asking if I'm okay and other mom stuff. She had heard from John's mom, who called in saying that John's siblings would not be at school the rest of the week because of his death. My mom was a secretary at the school I went to. I can't help but think that something paranormal had happened to allow me to make peace with and say goodbye to my friend and have some bit of closure. He was 25 when he died of an overdose and was the first person really close to me who had died. This is going to sound like a bad creepypasta, but I have only shared the story once in nearly a decade, so might as well to strangers. About 9 to 10 years ago in August, me and two buddies, all 14, wanted to get up to a bit of fun after my friend bought a ceramic smoking device. It was a beautiful day out, so we decided to make an adventure of it. Let's call them Steve and Ian, not real names. Much of it is being developed now, but there used to be many small forests on the edges of the city, deep enough to get lost in for a few hours, and we had one nearby along the main river running through. Besides a couple in athletic gear, our small group was alone there and went east from the road about 40 minutes before finding a nice secluded area with a good fallen tree to sit on. We lit up and were enjoying nature and talking. No intense reactions, as we had all been smoking here and there around the year. I want to say 30 minutes, and that athletic couple must have made a round and was coming back and ran across us. We were on a blocked off section of path that gets closer to the river, and it got us pretty paranoid. They had just given us a smile and kept walking, but the mood was different. Ian was very vocal about it, to say the least. The glitch part of this could potentially include the couple, but the major part is none of us remember putting everything back in the backpacks and hiking back to the clearing just before the road. Those who smoke know your eyes may play tricks on you, but you're not exactly going to hallucinate, and you may zone out for a few minutes, but we full on would have had to go up and down hills, over fallen trees, and across a small bridge which crossed a deep gap filled with stones and broken branches in order to get to the field. I remember coming back to nearly in the middle of the clearing with no recollection of the hike out. My friend Steve was flipping out a bit about the situation, and Ian was just as usual, come on let's go. We headed out to get some food. It all kind of died down and we drifted a few years later, but that is a day I will remember for the rest of my life. I was in a dark mood and went back last year during a warm week of January. Spent about 4 hours wandering around, about 1:30s. Now a new housing development, but the field area was almost the same link. That line of trees is just in front of the ravine and the walking bridge would be close to the middle. TLDR, to boil it down to basic, me and two buddies went to smoke deep in a forest clearing near the river, got paranoid by two random hikers, and collectively lost about half an hour's memory of getting out of that section of the forest, snapping back to reality in the middle of a clearing near the road. For anyone with some experience in the subject, you will know that is not common. You may not believe this, but a lot of my family members was there to witness it. When I was very young, my dad bought this apartment, and it was a bit old, and had to be repainted. One time he took my mom and I there, and left us on the 3rd floor. I was still very young, around 2 to 3 years old, so of course I can't remember this. He went upstairs to the 4th floor to repaint the walls by himself. After a bit, he came downstairs and told my mom that he wasn't feeling well and if we could leave immediately. On the way home, my mom was curious to know what happened, as my dad looked kinda pale and wasn't talking at all. My dad told her that he felt like there was someone standing next to him. He was in a squat position when he was painting, so he wasn't able to see the person completely. But he described him wearing jeans, a reddish jumper and a few other features that I can't exactly remember. My dad was too scared to look up and just quickly ran downstairs, and that's when we left. My mom told him it's okay, he's probably just too tired and should just get some rest when we're home. So we finally arrive home, and when we went in, my grandmother shouted at my dad and told him to hurry and come watch the TV. His best friend was on the news and had killed himself at the airport going through the security when they found him with guns. He was wearing the exact same outfit that my dad had described. My mom and dad just stood there not being able to believe it. My dad didn't go back to their apartment for a few days after that. It sounds crazy, but my mom would never lie about something like this. And whenever I ask my mom and dad about the story again, it's told the exact same way. Last year I was in California for a wedding. We rented out a studio house from Airbnb. After the wife and I get ready, I gathered up the usual items, keys, phone, glasses, and started to look for my wallet. I couldn't find it anywhere, and I had just used it to buy some food at the market down the street earlier that morning. I know I had it when I got back because I gave the receipt to my wife, which I always put in my wallet. We tore that studio apart looking for my wallet, under the bed, in the closet, in the trash, the fridge, you name it, we looked there. We even called the market to make sure I hadn't left it. I also retraced my walk from the market, about 150 steps. Nada, zilch, zero wallet. Well, needless to say we need to get on the road for the wedding, but I told my wife I wasn't going, and I was going to stay and keep looking. Wife leaves, I take off my tux jacket and hang it up in the closet, roll up my sleeves, and I start looking again. So, I mentioned it's a studio, so it's small. I look for another 10 minutes and I'm panicked. We live overseas and everything I need is intended that wallet, including my country civil ID, corporate business card, etc. I finally just stand there by the TV, and I'm thinking, what the fuck, man. All of a sudden I feel the need to turn around and look at the bed. There is my wallet, sitting plain as day on the bed. Comforter is white, wallet is brown. No pillows, not covered up in any way by clothes, nothing. Just sitting there mocking me. It's like it dropped from the sky. Still gives me chills. This isn't creepy, but it's a story that I've been waiting to tell, and this seems like the perfect place. One of my first jobs out college is partying on an indie movie set in New York City, winter of 2004 or 2005. This is relevant because my phone didn't have a real camera on it, or I would have taken a photo. Set was in the upper part of the Upper West Side, Morningside Heights, and my job that day was to lock up a big crane they had parked on the street to hold a lighting rig for the window of the apartment they were shooting in. This essentially meant I was just sitting outside all day making sure no one faked with the crane. At some point during the day I look up and notice a bird hovering above me, not flying, hovering, as in it would sometimes flap its wings, but it was not changing its location at all, not a circular path or even up or down. Very hard to give a precise number here, but would estimate this happening anywhere from 7 to 10 stories up, and it went on for something like 10 to 20 minutes. I was so bored that I just stared and figured there had to be some sort of scientific aerodynamic explanation for what was happening. But I do remember it not being an especially windy day, so it just looked and felt so unnatural. So much so that it stuck with me for this long. Eventually the bird disappeared when I turned my head, so I guess it flew off or disintegrated, depending on who you ask. I don't think I've ever had an experience that I would call supernatural, and I definitely wouldn't call this that, but glitch in the matrix was always the way I had it filed away in my brain. Just a weird thing. TLDR. I once saw a bird stuck in the exact same spot in the sky for a disturbingly long period of time. I will never forget this as long as I live. I had to be around 8 years old. My family used to have a trailer in Ohio in the middle of farm/Amish country. We would go there occasionally on weekends for fun. Me and my sister became good friends with these two girls who were twins there and whose parents' trailer was right next to ours. One day, a huge storm ripped through the area. There was this ginormous oak tree between a few trailers that fell down. No one was hurt, but it was very close to my family's trailer. A cleaning crew came to clean it up. Because of this, my parents agreed we should have a sleepover at the twins' trailer to stay away from the danger of this large tree. So, me and my sister went over there, and we set up sleeping bags on the main living room floor. The morning comes, and I happen to wake up very early, it day around 6 or 7 am. Then, the weirdest and creepiest thing that's probably ever happened to me happens. I slowly open my eyes facing away from the strange thing I'm about to see. As I gather myself, I roll over to see this old lady sitting in a rocking chair, slowly rocking, just staring at us with a very bland expression on her face. I was literally speechless as I had no idea who she was. I was so startled that I quickly rolled back over and threw the blanket over my head. I sat there terrified, refusing to look again only to eventually fall back asleep. When I woke back up, there was no one there. I know for a fact this wasn't a dream. I have never been able to get the sight of her out of my head. I'd like to state that I had known these girls for a few years and had never seen this lady, ever. I have a little one-eyed toy poodle named Choco, and he loves to play fetch. He could spend all day just running around the house and bringing toys back to you. Sometimes we even throw stuff for him when we are half paying attention, watching TV or playing games. He never gets tired of it. He's also very persistent. If a toy happens to roll under a chair or reach some other inaccessible place, he'll sniff around and explore until he finds the optimal location to squeeze himself under there and grab the toy. He always shows a determined little sneer while he's doing that, which is very cute. One day, I was absent-mindedly throwing a little orange ball for Choco. It was very distinctive, the only one of that color and design we own. On one throw, I accidentally hit the couch and watched it fall between the cushions. I knew Choco wouldn't be able to get it down there, so I got up to go dig it out for him. But when I reached between the cushions, the ball wasn't there. I took the cushions off, lifted the couch, and dug as deep as I could into the inner workings, but it was nowhere to be found. Choco was looking at me excitedly and poking around nearby, just like when he searches for one of his entry points. He had seen it go in there too and was trying to find it himself. But I gave up eventually and went back to whatever it was I was doing. About 20 minutes later I got up to go to the bathroom, which is on the opposite side of the house. Right in front of the bathroom, in the middle of the hallway, was sitting that little ball. There's no way it could have landed there from where I threw it, especially because it landed on the couch and didn't go through any doorways. My parents don't believe me, but I maintain that that ball glitched its way over there. I went camping with about 10 of my friends for the weekend in SoCal. We had been drinking and smoking weed most of the day. The first thing I noticed that was strange was when I looked at the time on my iPhone and it showed as 2 am when it was still around 8 pm and about to get dark. I checked with another friend and confirmed on their phone that it was still around 8 pm, so I figured my phone had glitched out since we have no signal. About an hour or two I called out early and went to my tent to call it a night. So I pack and knock out, and then suddenly I remember waking up in my tent and there are 3 shadow figures over me. They looked completely void of light. One to my left, one to my right, and the other in front by my feet. They all grab me, and my whole body starts vibrating. It felt as if my soul was attempting to leave, but they were holding it down, and somehow I can hear one of them says to me in my head, "It's not time yet." These beings felt like they were trying to help me. Then I suddenly wake up from the dream in the middle of the night, and it felt like it had just happened. I'm shaking at this point and completely freaked out. I open the tent and see that everyone is sleeping, and there's nothing out of the ordinary, so I go back to sleep. The next day I tell my friends over breakfast. They laugh about it and say it was just a dream, but you tried to tell them it felt like nothing I had experienced before. Fast forward 2 weeks later. I'm sleeping in bed at home, and I suddenly wake up with the same lucidity that I had felt before at the campsite. Suddenly my whole room is illuminated in bright white light from my window, and these 3 white beings slowly start walking towards my bed. 1 stand at the end by my feet and 2 come by my right side. The other stops by my knee and the one that seemed to be the lead walks right next to me and leans down, and I could now make out the face which looked like the alien from Predator without its mask on, but somehow in all white. He leans down to my face and says, "You're not supposed to know." Then they walk back to the light at the window, the light disappears, and then I wake. I have a vivid memory from when I was a kid, probably about 30 plus years ago. Something was going on at my house. My grandpa used to drink a lot, and one night brought someone over whom my mom refused to let in the house. I was young, probably 5 years old, so I was told to go to the living room away from the argument. I remember someone knocking at the door and I went to open it because everyone was arguing about my grandpa's friend. There are 3 old ladies at the door and they tell me their car broke down and need to use the phone. I'll let them come in and use the phone, and I remember my sister, prob about 13 or so at the time, got mad at me for letting strangers in the house. This then turned the attention away from my grandpa to the strangers I let in the house. I remember being yelled at for answering the door and talking to strangers. Throughout my life I swear my sibling bring it up every so often. For some reason a few years ago I asked my mom about this. She says she remembers my grandpa and the argument that night, but not about me letting strangers in the house. She said she was outside in the garage yelling at my grandpa and to call and ask my sister. I call her, but she doesn't remember. I call our older brother and he says he doesn't remember it. Call my other 2 brothers and they laugh at me saying that never happened. I swear it wasn't a dream, because it's something I had thought about every once in a while. Everyone in my family agrees that the grandpa thing happened, but no one remembers the 3 old ladies that used our phone. My sister and I were in one of the small towns in Cinque Terre in Italy. It was late afternoon on the first day we were there, and we took a walk up to a cemetery that's on top of a hill overlooking the ocean. On our way down, we ran into an old lady. The woman chatted with us for a while. I wish I could remember about what. My memory of the conversation is super hazy, like trying to remember a dream, but I have the sense that it was sort of a profound conversation about life and death and the meaning of it all. When the conversation ended, my sister and I let the old woman go down the path ahead of us, so we wouldn't keep running into her and have that awkward moment when you've already said goodbye to someone and then see them again. There was a fork in the path ahead, and we saw the lady take the path to the right. We had come up from the left side, but wanted to see some new scenery on our way down, so we decided to follow the old lady and take the right fork. After just a couple of minutes of walking, the path dead-ended into bushes. There was no way out, except to turn around and go back. The old woman would have had to either do some serious bushwhacking, or to have walked past us. But we never saw her again. My sister and I remarked to each other how odd it was to run into this old lady on the path from the cemetery around sunset, and then for her to just disappear. Also not sure why there was a path going that way at all, if it just led to a dead end. But that's a less creepy thought than the disappearing old lady thing. This is something I've never understood. Happened not that long ago, but it's become a life lesson of sorts for me. Also, this is the first time I'm typing it out, so I apologize if it's too long. I moved back into my parents' house after grad school for some time. I smoke and it's not something my father would ever be comfortable with. Thought my mother knows. Once, I was out with them and ended up being quite tipsy by the time I reached home. I desperately wanted a cigarette and made my way to their bathroom to smoke one near the exhaust. When I stubbed it out, I ended up dropping the stub. I instantly looked towards the ground and couldn't spot it. I checked to see if I dropped it in the pot. Nope. Checked my pockets and my shirt. Nope. Crawled around the floor looking, while my parents wondered why I was taking so long. Still can't find it. I spent more than 3 hours over the course of the night and the next morning looking for it. I was still scared of my dad spotting the smoked cigarette, so I headed for a shower in the washroom and did another sweep, after which I checked my clothes again. When I realized it wasn't anywhere, I decided to let it go. I didn't know where it went, but if I couldn't find it, how would they? I didn't have much of an option anyway. 2 months later, the morning I was moving to my own place, my father was heading to the kitchen at 4 in the morning and there was a cigarette butt right outside my closed bedroom door. He woke my mother. She said she didn't know how it reached there. She mentioned it to me, and I said the same, though I looked at the button. It was the same brand I smoked that night. I usually smoke another one. Now I don't know how it got there, far away from where I dropped it, or where it was for 2 months, but I took it as a signal that it was time to leave home. If I spent so long covering for bad habits, my father didn't mention it, and I moved out that afternoon. I often look at life decisions that come back to affect me later as lost cigarette butts now. Life lesson: nothing is ever lost. Things come back to bite you in the ass when you least expect it. I've posted this before. I still find it strange. I must have been around 6 or 7. Never had an interest in Lego, but I loved Ghostbusters and ghost stuff in general. It was 1989, and I saw the advert on TV for the Lego Ghost House, and didn't care for the set, but I wanted the ghost minifigure so much. At the time you could only get that figure with the set. My parents were very poor, and couldn't afford to get me the set, let alone even know what Lego even was. They were always at work. I spent most my days with my grandma. In our house we had a large cupboard where my gran stored her Indian spices, crisps and treats. Sometimes I used to was about in there and play. I remember one day I'll never forget, I was searching some crisps to eat, reached out to get a packet and actually ended up with the Lego ghost figure I wanted. None of this made sense to me, but I remember how damn happy I was just to have this little stupid ghost figure in my hand. The strange thing was the figure was just the ghost, and not the figure it sits on or the set it came with. It was just the plastic sheet that went over the Lego man. No other kids lived in that house. My gran didn't speak English well, and never would brought me that figure. My parents didn't have much money back then, and why just get me the figure without the set? And how is this possible? I don't have the figure anymore, but I'm tempted to purchase one today for the memories. My first and only experience of the supernatural begins somewhat ironically in a year 9 science class, when I absent-mindedly sat down on a stool at the start of the lesson, my young mind eager to learn the secrets of the universe. Little did I know I was going to get my wish. Some minutes passed until we began the practical part of the lesson. On standing up to reach excitedly for the Bunsen burner, I was surprised to feel myself unstick from my seat. I turned around to see in my confusion a pink string dangling from somewhere on my posterior, connected to what really was a gigantic wad of chewing gum that had been placed as booby trap by my peers. If not for my current predicament, I would almost be impressed by their Herculean chew. It really was huge. With some trepidation I decide to survey the impact site, ground zero if you will, where I observe a bubbly mass on my left cheek that could only be described as something out of a Cronenberg movie. Any attempt to remove or reduce the mass seemed futile, only resulting in more thin strands of pink dangling as a choir of perverse wind chimes, each one mocking me for my hubris. So I began to panic. I should say at this point in my school career I was well acquainted with the shameful tang of total humiliation, and as a result I had just about zero self-esteem. It was at this moment of utter defeat, of acceptance of my place as nothing more than a grain of sand, to be washed by the infinite tides of fate, that suddenly something deep within me awoke, and in this zen-like moment of clarity, I decided to stop caring, and instead wear my gum splodge like a badge of honor. Fuck it, this is my life now. So I continued on with the rest of the lesson, boiled some fluids with my Bunsen, and forgot all about it. On leaving the class my predicament came back to me, and I noticed it was odd that no one had made a snarky comment. If anything, people were ignoring me more than usual. So I swivel my little year 9 head to look down to my rear, and lo and behold, against all reason the gum has completely disappeared. I'd never been so pleased to see my own as in all of its burgeoning pubescent glory. My only experience of the supernatural is admittedly an odd one. Perhaps not the one I would have chosen, though it remains to this day the only event of my life to which I am unable to provide a sufficient explanation. All I know is that it happened, and then it did not. TLDR, God is real. He showed me by performing the miracle of the gum bun removal. About 2 years ago I came home from school early as I had an exam, and we were allowed to leave after it. It was probably around 12 PM and my sister was off sick that day. We started talking, and she casually mentioned that my mum was home for lunch. This made no sense to me, because my mum worked in a different town at the time and she never came home for lunch, because the drive was too long and there was just no point. I asked her if she talked to her, and here's what she told me happened. My sister was upstairs in her room when she heard someone come in through the front door, so she went to see who it was. She stood at the top of the stairs and saw our mum taking her coat off and hanging it up. She noticed my sister and turned around to look at her, but didn't say anything. Neither did my sister, and she went back to her room after this. This whole thing seemed really weird to me because my mum never came home for lunch, and she definitely wouldn't say nothing at all. She would at least say hi and most likely start a conversation. At this point I was like, okay, this is weird, but maybe she did come home. So I called my mum there and then and asked her if she'd been home for lunch, and unsurprisingly, she said no, she hadn't been. My sister didn't hear her leave either. TLDR, my sister saw our mum in our house when she was actually at work in a different town. I called her and she confirmed she hadn't been home. So who did she see? Before I met my husband, I had tested and qualified for a position as a corrections officer. I was waiting for the opportunity notification and hadn't heard anything in quite a while. I believe it was about a year later that I received the ML point. During that year, I met the man I'd marry and we moved different town, same county, started working on a home, got married. The good stuff. Point one of our projects was replacing the windows in our master bedroom. My husband was historically lax in personal protective gear, often performing renovations in flip-flops and never with a mask or safety glasses. The Sunday he was replacing windows, his nephews were with him, and I said, you should be mindful of their impressionable minds, put on some sneakers at least. The next day, Monday, I was talking with my coworkers and said, you know, it kills me that he's so obtuse about PPE. Really, what would it take to wear some shoes and glasses? And when I got home from work, he was replacing the exterior window trim on the windows he'd just replaced by removing the nails from the old trim and nailing it back onto the house on the ladder in flip-flops. He was using the neighbor's table saw, and I was just getting ready for a walk when I heard the saw stop abruptly, and my husband, of 2 months, yelled, "Fuck." He'd missed a nail and it shot out of the saw blade and punctured the globe of his eye, the point resting just on the optic nerve and shredding his retina point. While we were in the air in a shady part of my state, surrounded by multiple Coast Guarding inmates in cuffs and ankle shackles, my husband nearly delirious with fear and me actually having a panic attack, I received the email from the county corrections office informing me that positions were available. 18 hours later, retinal and corneal surgeons removed the nail. Multiple surgeries, and 20 months later, he can only see light or not light from the injured eye and isn't expected to regain vision beyond what he has now. He has no depth perception and gets frequent headaches from light stimulation in the damaged eye. Point I keep thinking, if I'd just not voiced that fear out loud, he would have been okay. Point the co thing was an untimely coincidence, odd nonetheless, but the eye thing, weird. I'm way too late for this thread, but here it goes. When I was in college, my friends and I would get together and watch bad sci-fi and horror movies and mock them. We were very into MST3K at the time, like a lot of college-age nerds, and made it a point to do this once a week. I offhandedly told a classmate that Saturday afternoon we'd be picking some random trash movie and making fun of it, and he implored me to seek out a Christmas horror movie called Santa's Sleigh. He said it was one of the most absurd movies he'd ever seen. It starred Goldberg, now, the wrestler, as a murderous Santa Claus who terrorizes people on Christmas. He said he watched it with his high school friends every December. It was May, so it was a little out of season, but it sounded so absurd and perfect that my friends decided to watch it that week. My friend who works at a Best Buy says he saw it on the shelf and says he'll buy it for us. He's late, but finally shows up with the DVD. We pop it in, have a grand old time riffing on this movie, and then it's over. I grab the remote, kill the movie, switch the input back to cable, and the movie somehow starts again. The music swells, and the cold open before the title card starts, and I think, what the hell? What did I just hit? I spend a minute fumbling around before I just eject the DVD. The DVD pops out, but the movie keeps playing. I suddenly realize I'm watching this on cable. It's on TV. In May. At the exact time we decided to watch it on DVD. I'm blown away. How astronomical are the odds that this would happen? It's not Christmas time, not even close. My friend was late with the DVD, or we would have watched it and turned off the TV without ever even knowing that Santa's sleigh started exactly when we stopped the movie. None of my friends even cared or thought it was weird for some reason, which was the most infuriating part. They couldn't even see why I was so fucking blown away that this happened. I still think about it from time to time. TLDR, my friends randomly decided to watch Santa's Sleigh on a Saturday in spring, and as soon as it ended Santa's Sleigh started playing on cable. I'm not sure I'd call this a glitch. Sounds like your typical ghost story, but I'm also not sure it actually ever happened, or was this person's imagination. I'll try to keep it short. Mother died when I was in my teens. She died in our house. There were questions on how she died. There was an investigation, etc. Anyways, we move out with our dad. Life continues on. When I was 20, was driving by my old house with my girlfriend and saw the family that had moved in a while after we had moved out. They were having a garage sale. I introduced myself, explained how I used to live there, and we had small talk. They said I could go in and walk around if I wanted to for memories. It felt really weird, just because my last memories in there was about 5 years earlier, and I was always wondering if I'd ever see her ghost, etc. Nothing happened. Showed my girlfriend the house, and as we were leaving, I felt compelled to ask this woman a question, and partly because my girlfriend and I were into those ghost shows on TV. But I asked her, I was just wondering, and I'm sorry if this is weird, but have you ever had any experiences in the house knowing my mother passed away in it? By the way, they were aware before moving in. She said actually there were 2 times something weird has happened. The first time I woke up to a baby crying. The problem is, my kids are 5 and 7, and when I went to go look they were sound asleep. I found out my mother had a miscarriage before me, but that still wouldn't explain that. The other time, my husband was out working late, so I was home with the kids alone. I remember laying in bed and felt the need to look up. I looked up into the doorway and saw the figure of a woman standing there looking at me. I was frozen, but said out loud, I'm sorry for whatever happened to you, but my family and I live here now, so please don't scare us. And she says ever since then she hasn't had any issues. The home has had 2 other owners since then, I think. So I have always wondered if my mother's spirit is still lurking in that home, or if she has moved on. My sibling has had some other personal experiences, but it could also have been her emotional and distraught mind dealing with it all, such as feeling a hand holding hers, or smelling my mother's perfume. Back in elementary school we had a disciplinary system that was a stoplight. Everyone had a cloth spin with their name on it, and it started clipped to the green light on this paper stoplight in the front of the class. If you got in trouble, didn't do homework, or any other disciplinary action, you had to go to yellow light. Your cloth spin was moved from green to yellow. Red light was the second escalation, and meant a note home to your parents. My mom worked as a teacher's aide in the school for the younger kids, so she always knew what went on in my class. Small school. This meant that I had to admit to any yellow lights I got. I would get punished for doing something wrong at school. So I rarely did get on yellow light. This one night I have this vivid dream. I forget all of the details or the story of my dream, except that it was my house, and it was my brother and I getting ready for school. My mom was wearing this yellow turtleneck sweater in my dream, and it just so happened that I got on yellow light later on in my dream. I remember the yellow sweater because I remember my mom getting upset with me for getting in trouble, and the irony of how I got on yellow light and my mom was wearing a yellow sweater. The next morning I wake up. My mom is wearing the yellow sweater. I remember feeling like I already somehow got in trouble. Sure enough, later on that day in school at recess, me and the boys in the class are playing tag like usual. A group of the boys playing tag were purposely harassing the girls and messing up their jump rope thing. The teacher warned them multiple times to stop. Towards the end of recess, the teacher just made all of the boys playing tag go to yellow light, including myself. She just assumed it was all of the boys, not just a few points, so the premonition stood. I was trying extra hard not to get on yellow light that day, but out of my power I was still wrongly accused of harassing the girls jump roping, and I got put on yellow light. It blew my faking mind as a kid. Like somehow I had these psychic powers. That my psychic powers were so in tune that my subconscious mind had to inform me of the injustice that will be done. Point still freaks me out to this day. Ghost horses. I once spent a summer on a US Forest Service trail crew building and maintaining trails in the wilderness of Montana. It was an early to bed, early to rise job for sure. Late in the summer, we were camped in a high base and working on the trail above camp. We hiked from below, and camp was on the side of the trail in an established site. The area was no joke, 20-ish miles from the nearest road. Remote as fuck. And apparently, it was haunted by ghost horsemen. One night in late summer, we had bedded around 7 p.m., and it was maybe 7:30 p.m., dusk, when we heard horses coming into camp. You could hear the jingling of metal and impacts of their hooves. It was hunting season, so random horsemen were not too unusual. Most of us were eating in our backpacking tents, but our crew boss got up and had a conversation with the horsemen. They were disappointed. Were we camping in their spot? We could all hear it. And like that they were off down the trail into the night. The next morning we talked about the horsemen at breakfast. They were only the second visitors we had had in months. And then our boss sent me and a coworker down the trail to trim some brush or something for the morning. We followed the trail and the horse tracks for about a mile, and then they disappeared. Mind you, we were very attuned to the area, since we had been working on the trail for about a month at that point. The odd thing was that there was nowhere else to ride horses. The trail ran down the drainage with dense brush, rocks, and the creek on either side, and did so for about 7 miles before it hit the next junction. But alas, no horse tracks. After about a mile fucking weird. Once we were done with our task, my coworker and I hiked back up the trail, past camp, and rejoined our crew about 2 miles about camp. In the process, we picked up the horse tracks again, but they disappeared about a mile above camp as well. Mind you, we had been working on the trail so there was fresh soft dirt in both directions. We eventually hiked in/out of camp several times to go get supplies. We traveled both directions, and there were no more horse tracks in either direction for miles. Horse tracks/poop and boot prints, human sign, can stay on a wilderness trail for months, but there was nothing in either direction after the first mile or so. Goddamn ghost horses. When I was 13, one day me and my parents were in a convenience store that we typically visited on a weekly basis, and my mom let me choose a calendar made there. We were weeks into a new year. The calendars always had an image of Mexican story or setting, of which they had a variety of them, and I can clearly remember the image of the calendar I chose. It was a man wearing cowboy attire with a very large sombrero with a rifle in his back and an ammo strap entering a clay house, holding a small bag of corn tortillas and greeting a woman, who I'm assuming is his wife, who is cooking some beef dish on a boiling pot. The woman was wearing a Mexican dress. She held a smile, looking directly at him with a wooden spoon in hand. When at the checkout there was no other calendar there than the one I chose. Once home, I placed it on the fridge. The following morning my calendar was no longer there, and instead there was another calendar, made by the same convenience store, that held a different image. It was a guy wearing cowboy clothes and riding a bull in a stadium. The previous image was a drawing/painting, while this one was an actual picture. Freaked the fuck out. I asked my parents about it, assuming they may have switched it without me knowing. They simply said no. So young and stupid me assumed the worst and looked all over my house for the original one. Under the cupboard, beneath the fireplace, behind the damn toilet. I wasn't very bright back then, and my backyard, all to no avail. To this day I still maintain that I placed the calendar of the couple. This is so late, but here goes anyways. This past winter there was a heavy rainstorm that had knocked out the power to my house. I wasn't home, but my sister said she heard our home phone ringing in the kitchen. It's a landline, so if one were to ring, all the phones in the house would be ringing. But it was just the one in the kitchen. She had sent a Snapchat video to me, and the creepiest part was that the ringtone was not the usual ringtone our home's phones have. It was a strange high-pitched rapid two-tone beeping as opposed to the regular trill of a phone you'd expect to hear. She tells me she picked up, hears complete silence on the other end, and then a goodbye, and someone disconnecting the line. The first time she told me this, I didn't exactly believe her. I was thinking that perhaps the power had come back, and she just didn't realize. Then it happens again. This time I'm home alone. A heavy windstorm had swept through our area and had knocked out power in numerous neighborhoods. I had just woken up from a nap and thought our house still had electricity. Came down to the kitchen to grab a bite when I hear the phone ring, that strange distinct ringtone. I look over and see that the phone's digital screen is completely blank, showing that it was off. Along this wall, we also have our convection oven plugged in. Its digital screen was also off, meaning there was definitely no power in the house. I was too chicken shit to answer it though. Kind of hoping this happens again during the next power outage, so we can investigate further. I'm a little late to the thread. Boo it. I was in class one day, and this was directly after lunch, so this wouldn't be explained by "oh you're just tired." Anyways, I was playing with a pencil, and I have this horrible habit of flipping pencils and pens in my hand. I'm fiddling with this pencil, and, not paying attention, drop it. Now, the floors in the room are those cheap, shiny tiles that you would find in a cafeteria, and I plain as day heard it hit the floor. I look down and it's gone. Everyone's backpacks are either on their chairs or on the table, and my hand was off to the side above the ground when I dropped it. This pencil is also a bright neon green as well as mechanical, so there's no way I could miss it. It also has that little notch, or whatever you call the part that's supposed to attach to your shirt, ripped off. I spend a solid 2 minutes hunched over in my chair looking for this pencil, and it is nowhere. Everyone around me is giving me weird looks, but no one moves or does anything about it. Here's the weirdest part. Later that day, we are getting out of school and my friend stops me. He sat next to me in the hour I lost my pencil. He looks me dead in the eye and holds up my pencil, a neon green mechanical pencil with the notch ripped off. I should also note my friend didn't move at all during that entire class period and was fully engrossed in Read Magic the Gathering lore on his computer. He simply says "you dropped this during world geography" and walks off. After I say thanks, the best part is I couldn't find that pencil in my backpack the next day. This is the weirdest faking thing. This whole story just happened to me. About 3 months ago my school started auditions for its production of Peter Pan. I think, heck why not, should be fun. I had a few friends who had done previous shows who also encouraged me to join. Regardless, I got called back for the role of a lost boy, and I was very excited. Our first rehearsal had just ended, and I was very happy about the whole endeavor, so while waiting for my mom to pick me up I plugged in my one and only pair of black AKG headphones, love them to bits, and started listening to music. I get picked up at around 9:30, rehearsal ended at 9, and my little sister is already sitting shotgun of my family's minivan. Not thinking much about the situation, I sit in the third row of the van and fall asleep. We get home and I, being tired and having just woken up from a nap, stumble inside. When I got in my room I looked for my earbuds, but I couldn't find them, so I went to bed. Left my house the next morning early on a family trip somewhere. I sit in the third row of the minivan, and there my earbuds are. I was very happy to find I didn't lose them, and I then spent the ride listening to music. When we arrived I wrapped up my headphones and set them down on my seat. When my family got back to the car I noticed that the earbuds were gone. Looked everywhere for 3 months for my earbuds, and after finishing the final showing of Peter Pan tonight my mom picked me up with my siblings in the van. I go to sit in the back row, and there are my black AKG earbuds neatly wrapped up. I've always had very vivid, frequent dreams that I can alter at will. I remember the exact moment that I found out that everyone else didn't remember exact details from the 5+ dreams that they had the night before. I remember learning about lucid dreaming and being super confused because how could anyone not know that they were asleep? How could they not feel that they were laying in a bed rather than being chased through the woods by a bear or whatever? Anyway, I've had probably hundreds of situations where my dream life and real life kind of get mixed up. I've had plenty of deja vu, where I'll dream something and then, days/weeks/months later, that thing will happen. Occasionally, the changed bits cross over too. For example, sometime in the summer before 10th grade, I had a dream that I was on the marching band practice field with my bandmates, doing the same drills over and over and over. I was so sick of it, and I remember that, in the dream, it was so hot outside and I thought, ugh, I'm not doing this anymore. I'll just faint and someone can carry me back to the band hall. Fast forward to September, and I'm on the band field. It's Mississippi, so it's over 100 and I'm melting. And we've played the same 9 measures of Smooth by Santana at least 50 times. I look around, because things are starting to feel familiar and I think, I dreamed this. What happens next? Then, 5 minutes later, I wake up on the floor of the band hall. The EMTs tell me that I have heat exhaustion and say something like, hell, of course you do. I don't know how more kids haven't passed out. If they were making me march around out there, I'd just pretend to pass out so that I could come back inside. And I remembered how my dream ended. I would swear my house was haunted when I was a kid. The first time it happened, I practically shit myself. I was sitting in my room playing a game on my northeasts when the power goes dead. I was pissed because I was mid-game, but then I hear something coming from the living room down the hall, and I'm the only person home. I nervously go to check it out, and the VCR is repeatedly ejecting and withdrawing a tape that was inside it. I freak out and unplug the damn thing, and it stops. I get the hell out, and the power comes on sometime later. I tell my mom what happened, and she knows about it. I thought she was pranking me. She then tells me that a spirit in the house told her that when the power goes out like that to press the 3 setting on the back right burner on the stove. I'm only 12 years old, but I know this is bullshit. Sure enough, I'm home alone again a week or so later, and it happens again. Power goes out, VCR regurgitating the tape. I'm not in a good place. I creep into the kitchen, press the 3 button and bam. Power's back on, and the VCR stops. I don't think I'd ever been so freaked out in my life. This went on for weeks. I was home alone often as a kid. My mom worked, and my brother would spend weekends with his dad. It got to the point where it just made me angry when it happened. I believed it was some kind of ghost, and I would chew it out, and we'd go tit for tat sometimes. Power off / power on, and it would just make me livid. Then, one day, my mom was doing laundry in the basement, and started screaming. She sprinted up the stairs to find me, and just held me, and wouldn't let go, and was crying like crazy. She said she felt something incredibly cold and dark moving on her, and it took off with the ghost that was haunting us. We never had the electrical issues again after that day. If it was all some elaborate prank, my mom went the long con. She pried the 3 button off the back burner entirely, and forbade anyone from using it, and no one ever did again. I had a dream once where I was in an auditorium, listening to a speech that a high school kid gave about his dog. I remembered it because it was so weird. Then, like I had the past few summers, I was working the summer camp for high school boys state, at my college. The kids get assigned to cities, elect mayors, and march in formation across campus to do various leadership events. It's sponsored by the Legion and ROTC runs most of it. One of the things they do is a speech competition. And what do you faking know, but a kid started talking about how our values are out of whack. To illustrate, he talks about his dog and the pain from its loss. He then mentions offhand that tens of thousands of kids die from malaria every year, and the comparable lack of emotion in the second statement is supposed to make you reevaluate our priorities. But anyway, during the part about his dog, I have this what the fuck, I've heard this before thing. I turn to my co-counselor and say, dude, I've heard this before in a dream. Bullshit. He tells me. I then proceed to faking quote the speech word for word about a sentence ahead of the kid. I was losing my shit and got kind of loud. It was on the 2nd tier balcony of a huge auditorium, so it wasn't disrupt the guy loud, but it was everyone within a seat can hear me loud. The kids are losing their shit too. They know I didn't write it because counselors want their cities to win, so I wouldn't have helped the other city's kid. When he got off the dog and onto the malaria, I didn't know the words anymore. To this day, I have zero explanation for how this happened. It's such a stupid thing to have such a weird synchronicity about, but I had it, and it was really faking weird. I was majorly doubting all religion at that point, and that bizarre experience was part of what led me back to religious thinking. It's easy to write off the supernatural, but when you have a dream literally come true, and you start predicting the future like some kind of cliche in a movie, it makes you realize that maybe there are things beyond our perception out there. Obviously much more than this led me back to religion, but the experience played a role in me accepting the possibility of the unknown again. This might be more of a ghost story, but when I was a kid the neighborhood I lived in had this lake that a friend and I would always hang out at. Mind you, this is rural TN. I remember the neighborhood itself as being in a perpetual state of homes being built, but certain parts were still very undeveloped. Big patches of woods and fields and such. Well, one day we were in this field that was sort of behind the lake on a hill. In typical kid fashion we were burning things at this row of trees. Turns out matches don't burn dead tree bark well enough to satisfy the curiosity of youth. So we got bored and walked off down this dirt road. 20 minutes later we come back the same way, on the road, and at the line of trees there's a parked car. We both start to panic, thinking shit, how did someone get back here? We only knew of one entrance, and that was a gate you had to climb over, and past that gate the road was wore out by erosion, and you had to climb up a steep bank by the lake's shore. We'd never seen a car back here before. Our second fear of being found out for playing with matches was all the more true. We walked up to the car and this tall skinny man, the husband, comes up to us and asks about there being a fire here. We look over and see the smoke and his bigger wife and 2 daughters that in my memory were twins wearing the same sort of white dress, younger than us too. Well, playing dumb, we didn't know what he was talking about, but the fire was sort of getting out of hand. I don't remember how this exchange worked out, but the next thing I know, bear with me, we are walking / scrambling back up the hill, having come from the lake with a car's floor mat each holding water that we had cupped to our stomachs. We must have done this 2 or 3 times, not really trying to piece any of it together. We had never seen a car as much as another human being back here, so to find a family was enough of a strange occurrence on its own. The 4th time coming back up the hill sloshing water with each step we found the area clear of any person or car. No wife, no daughters, no skinny man, and at that point the fire was a cinder. We faking flipped out, ran to our bikes, and hauled us back to the house shouting to each other how there was no way in hell a car could have gotten back there. Had a dream as an 8 to 9-year-old kid that I had gone into a crowded elevator and this guy that oddly resembled a rodent was telling me about beeping my car with my throat point at the last stop of the elevator. Him and I and a 3rd person who I didn't know got off into what seemed like the 4th or 5th floor of a parking garage I didn't recognize. We walked to the divide in the garage floors and beeped the car with the remote key, but the car was nowhere to be found. The rodent man took the car key, which was just a beeper with 3 buttons, out of my hand, and placed it on his throat, and pressed the beep. We heard a honk and we looked down, and the car was flashing 2 floors below us. 10 years later I tripped acid, and asked that someone designated drive my car with my friends and I around. We pick up some Italian guy that reminded me of a furry James Franco impersonator at a hotel and he agreed to drive us around. When the night was winding down at Miami Beach we headed back to our car in the parking garage, and as we took the elevator up I looked around and noticed that there were 2 strangers, my friend and I, and this Italian guy that resembled a rodent. I got a queasy feeling, and he started telling me about finding our car because we didn't know where we parked. My friend said we should beep it, and the Italian guy starts telling me to beep it with my throat, and not in my hand. At this point I was sure I was reliving my dream and I didn't really know what to expect or do, so I just kept quiet. Rest assured, we exited the elevator on the 5th floor. I tested beeping the car because I was on acid and didn't really realize what he was telling me, and he grabbed the remote out of my hand and beeped with his throat. The car, my car, was the 2 floors down and looked exactly like the car in my dream. I still don't know what to make of it. When I was about 16, I had a weird dream. It was one that always stuck with me because it was so vivid. In the dream, I'm standing at some tropical grotto. There's lush forest all around, except in this little grotto, where there's a waterfall in the background and a little pond below. It looked like something out of a movie. There's a woman in front of me facing away. I remembered her having very curly dark blonde hair and we were talking. That's one of the 2 things I could never remember from the dream. the topic of the conversation. The other was the woman's face. She was facing away, wearing khaki shorts and a white shirt. In the dream, I see myself playing with a camera so I can take a picture of her. She turns around and says, "Hope you're quick enough." I look up, and she's got her shirt lifted, and I'm looking at a spectacular pair of breasts. She laughs, covers up, and turns back around as she says, "Too slow." Dream is over. I always remember it as odd, because I'd never been anywhere tropical. I couldn't see this woman's face, probably because I was staring at her titties, and it was just not a normal dream for me. Fast forward 10 years. I'm in Hawaii on my honeymoon. My wife and I decide to drive the road to Hana. It's a sheet trip. Don't do it if you go to Hawaii. We are stopping at a lot of the little scenic vistas and grottos. You see where this is going, right? Yeah, I didn't point. We get to one, and she runs ahead. As she's walking, she's saying how stupid this ridiculously long drive is. I'm yelling ahead saying we can turn back. I grab the camera and head up the little path of wooden log steps. We're debating on whether or not to continue or turn back. I get a sense of deja vu as I'm walking up the path, but I don't realize anything until I get to the end of the path and I see the waterfall. It's the scene from my dream. My wife is standing there in khaki shorts and a white shirt exactly like in my dream. I look down at my camera, and in my head, I say to myself, "Hope you're quick enough." Just as I finish saying it in my head, she says it out loud. I look up, and she's standing there with the shirt pulled up showing me her goods. I don't even try to raise the camera, because I'm in shock. At the exact same time, we both says, "Too slow." She laughs, pulls her shirt down, and turns around to look at the waterfall again. I just stood there staring at her for a few minutes. She turns around and asks why I look like I've been slapped in the face. I tell her about my dream. She thinks I'm just trying to give her some cosmic romance bullshit because it's a honeymoon. I mentioned it about 10 years later, and she didn't even remember the incident, but she thought it was sweet that I supposedly had a dream about her several years before we even met. I've had a few weird things happen in my life. Back when I was in kindergarten, I had a little spinning top. Nothing special, just one of the cheap plastic ones. But I had taken it to school that day and forgot it there. I was kind of bummed out and was sitting on the toilet wishing I had it when I heard the sound of something dropping in front of the door. It was the spinning top. I was quite a few feet from the door, so it was pretty weird. Of course, looking at it now, I believe it was possibly in my pocket the whole time and fell out, but doesn't really explain why it was so far away from me and I couldn't find it beforehand. Another time when I was around 13 to 14, I was hanging around with a friend and we were messing around on some track and field equipment at the school athletic field. Well, after a while we decided to head to his house. We had just come from the local pizza place. We played pool there, pretty much one of the few things to do in a small town, and I had my own cue stick which I kept in a leather case and carried around. Well, I had forgotten it at the field. By the time we realized, it had started raining, so we rushed back on our bikes and decided to take the shortest path through the woods. Well, leading up to the trail to the woods there was this giant wood pile, and we were riding up past it when suddenly we saw a little kid all in white, looked like a little girl with a bonnet onto me, run around the wood pile laughing. Totally weird to us, since it was starting to rain, and they looked quite young, so we stopped and looked at each other, basically confirming we both saw the same thing. So I called out to the kid asking what they were doing. It was raining, and got no response, so we decided to look around the wood pile and there was no one there at all. Definitely no way they could have gotten past without us noticing. It was a clear spot, except the wood pile. Really freaked us out, and we sped off immediately to the field. It's not uncommon for me to randomly lose things. For instance, wallet, cards, passes, paper, especially when I was younger. As I grew older and got tired of being branded as careless, I decided to take extra caution with important things and being mindful, like literally saying out loud in my head that it's with me. Oddly enough, I lose those things when I do this check. Once I was on my way to get a visa to visit my then TLDR boyfriend, and I had to make sure I have everything, passport and other IDs and documents. I literally checked everything. I even shook my briefcase to make sure I hear it there. And as I was going out of the train, I looked down between the platform and the train and chuckled to myself how funny it would be to lose my things if it dropped there. Then went on my way to the embassy, only to be turned down because guess what? My passport and ID was not there in my closed case that I just checked as I was leaving the train. Fast forward 2.5 years, and I'm browsing FB, and I literally just discovered that it filters made from people I don't know. And lo and behold, there's a filtered message from an unknown who claimed to have picked up my passport at the station I got off of. Funny thing was that I retraced my steps and got back to that station not more than 15 minutes after leaving it, and it was not there, nor was it reported. Happened again 2 months ago. I was mentally checking for my Presto card, made sure it was in my pocket, but when I went to change back to my old clothes after work, it's not. The point it's like I have a blind spot in my brain where I just couldn't figure out how I'd lose something I literally made sure was just there. I think maybe I just go on autopilot too much. Okay, this one was weird. I was spending the whole day out, doing some shopping, and I had to check my account balance several times on that day and transfer money from one account to another, using a mobile app, for which I needed at the time the PIN code list type of card that had individual numbers for each time I accessed the mobile bank. So I spent a day wasting money, and I returned home, parked my car in my park spot, which was quite long away from my apartment, and went inside my apartment. I then remembered that I had some bills to pay and proceeded to just do that, but then I realized that I left my PIN card in the car and even remembered that it was on the dashboard. I searched my pockets, wallet, phone case etc. just for case, but it wasn't on me, so I accepted my poor fate, but I didn't want to go after a long day to retrieve it from my car. Next thing I do is that I throw my clothes that were on me to the laundry basket and go to shower, and after it, I take some fresh clothes and college pants from the closet and put them on. I then walk to the kitchen and notice that something is in my pocket, and when I put my hand in there, I feel instantly that it must be my PIN code card. I look at the cardinal, and it is just the same exact code card that I had with me all day long. I can't believe it, and go to check my car if I have just found an older card, but no, it had the same markings made by me that day, and same codes that I used that day. I have no explanation for this. This is related to my use of weed the past year, so don't be surprised that I had this experience cause I was in a different mindset. So the fourth time I smoked weed, I was trying really hard to inhale properly and hold it in as long and as effectively as I could with each puff. I coughed like a motherfucker. Now all I remember is that I went from coughing and dying 1 second to immediately losing all track of time and sense of self. I had smoked a gram and my tolerance is still very low. 1 puff to this day gets me faked. In that very moment of me just losing it, everything started to look very far away and like I was in a different dimension. A different planet wouldn't describe it because I was still seeing the same things but just differently. You ever seen those videos where people fuck with the camera angle and perspective so something really tiny is actually huge and something really huge is tiny? That's what being this high was like. And it had only been a minute. Skip to about 20 to 30 minutes. I cannot hear. I can only hear my music, but I can't hear it at the same time. I can taste the sight of my alarm clock glowing in the dark. And I start to slip into what I can only describe as tripping balls on weed. I don't even remember slipping into what I started seeing. All I remember is seeing it. I have a very vivid and hazy memory of what I saw. My whole body was wiggling and moving and squirming out of my control. I had no idea where I was. All I could see was this twirling congealed mass of colored stuff in front of me, all of it bouncing around and moving. Thoughts became physical, and I could only see this mass of moving stuff in front of me. I felt like I was running. Even as I opened and closed my eyes, I couldn't see my room. I had no idea what a room even was. All I knew was this faking. What the hell? All I know is that if there is a glitch in the matrix, I found it that night. I'm too scared to smoke with my parents at the house now due to this experience. I was not even me at the time. What if my parents walked in on me while I was tripping like that? This was only weed, and I'm destined to go back there and get that high again. See you again, glitch. I walked into a Wendy's in Queens and had a vision of death. I started crying and warned the staff to quit their jobs. 3 months later, a guy there quit his job, came back and took 7 employees and gunpoint into the freezer and shot and killed 6 of them. The one survivor was a girl who shot in her head and managed to get out and call the police. I once walked by an auto repair place and suddenly looked up at the building and felt like the ceiling would collapse on me. I warned the 2 guys working there that the building was unstable. The man laughed and said the building was old and strong, that some of the building collapsed on them and they dug him out of the rubble. There was a restaurant across the street from that auto shop that I walked in to get some food when I was on my way to sign up for the army. As I went to pay, I felt that old familiar feeling. But this time I wanted no part of it. I wanted it to stop. The cashier noticed my face and asked what was wrong. I said don't worry, just charge me. He insisted, and then I told him who I was and to not ask stupid questions. I then said fine. This place is going to burn down. The fire will start next door and burn 3 of the nearby buildings that summer. All 3 of those buildings burned down. I have seen people to come walking by and have imagined them in the middle of the street arguing and the woman pointing her finger in his face yelling. I sat there and watched them walk into the street and start yelling before she raised her finger and stuck it in his face. But unlike my vision, she was on the right. It was always like this in grade school. A library teacher embarrassed me in front of a whole group of people and I told him he would pay for it. He didn't come to work for the next 2 days. Then they announced that he had died in his sleep and the cops found his body. I've seen things so crazy and there were always witnesses. Some people live lives asking if things like that are possible. Not me. I've had about 60 or 70 incidents like that. I was working as an accountant at an amusement park for a while, so I got access to the security cameras. To make sure I can see if anyone is trying to rob me or whatever. Anyways, I work the night shift, so I'm usually there until 12 to 1 in the morning, and I'm supposed to call the night crew and let them know when I'm done. This way we can leave together. One night I ended up running into some issues with the money and was going to stay late at work. Naturally, I checked the cameras to see who I would be spending the night with, and I noticed the park was dark. It appeared to have been shut down already. I low-key freaked out and checked the time, but it was only 12:05, so there was no reason for them to have forgotten about me. I called them downstairs and the phone line sent me to a busy dial about 3 times. So I tried a different department and it just kept ringing without anyone picking up. I was frustrated and in disbelief that I was locked in, so I looked through the cameras one more time. Again the park was dark with only floodlights active in certain areas. I grabbed my phone to use as a light and headed out there to set off the alarm. As soon as I open the door I see a bunch of people walking around and all the lights on. I freaked out and ran back inside my office to check if the cameras are broken, but nope, now I can see all the lights on and the people walking around. I quickly finished my work and left before anything else could happen. I never mentioned it to anyone since the place is supposed to be haunted, but I said I didn't believe in ghosts. It's a long story, but a true story. Here is a real story point. When I was about 3 or 4 years old I was playing with 2 of the neighbor kids of the same age in the front yard when we decided it would be fun to fly. We really didn't know how to do it, but I jumped up and did a kind of swan dive and stayed in the air a couple of feet off the ground. I was floating with my stomach towards the ground. The 2 other kids joined in, and we were having a great time floating above the ground learning how to push off on each other and to twirl and spin. We only had just begun to do these things, no more than a minute or 2, and a man came along the sidewalk dressed in a off-white almost dull yellow suit. He had short cropped grey hair, maybe blonde in color. I believe he wore a white tie. Anyway, he said to us something like, "You are not supposed to be able to do that yet," and we regained our feet and stopped doing it. At the same moment we felt a little ashamed and the 2 girls ran home to their houses, and I, a boy, ran into my house. I ran into the kitchen and told my mother about floating and the man telling us to stop, and she said, "You must have been daydreaming." I didn't know what daydreaming was, but I asked her if my two friends had been daydreaming also. She looked at me strangely and told me to keep it to myself and to go out and play. Not too long after that, the girls came back and we once again tried to do it, but of course we could not. Years later I saw one of these kids and I asked her if she remembered anything about the experience, and she had a vivid recollection of the event. Writer unknown.